overdose deaths. I'm sure that every single member of this committee knows constituents and their families who have been tragically impacted by illicit narcotics, especially synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Fentanyl is the deadliest drug threat that our country has ever faced. That's a direct quote from a letter the Drug Enforcement Administration wrote me this past December. In 2021, over 100,000 people tragically lost their lives to drug overdose in the United States, the majority caused by fentanyl. In 2022, again, over 100,000 people lost their lives to drug overdose, again, with the majority caused by fentanyl. We must continue to conduct oversight of the U.S. government's efforts to prevent these tragedies and must make sure programs are using the best available resources and targeting taxpayer funds where they will make the biggest impact. Director Gupta from the Office of National Drug Control Policy, or ONDCP, is well suited to provide this information to Congress today. ONDCP was formed with the mission to coordinate a government-wide effort to combat the loss of life and human misery caused by illicit narcotics. We need to understand from the ONDCP what is working, what isn't working, and what could be improved by legislation to prevent illicit drugs from coming into our country, entering our communities, and poisoning our families, friends, and neighbors. The DEA assesses that virtually all of the deadly fentanyl found in the United States is mass-produced by transnational criminal organizations in Mexico using precursor chemicals sourced from China and then smuggled in the United States across the southwest border. We need to know what ONDCP is doing to disrupt the criminal organizations that traffic in human misery and smuggle enormous quantities of drugs across our southern border. The border crisis caused by the Biden administration's policies has diverted resources and manpower away from securing the border. And cartel criminals take every tactical advantage they can to cross narcotics at our ports of entry and in between as well. We need to know what ONDCP is doing to ensure that our Customs and Border Protection officers and Border Patrol agents have the technology, legal authorities, and manpower to intercept and disrupt the flow of narcotics coming across the southern border. We need to know how ONDCP is working with law enforcement partners here and abroad to shut down the secret labs that manufacture poisonous fentanyl from depriving these labs of the chemicals they need to make fentanyl, to dismantling illicit financing networks that fund these labs. We need to know about the investments in prevention efforts, ensuring that the public is well informed of the dangers of fentanyl, how to obtain treatment for drug use disorders, and ensuring access to life-saving treatments like Narcan. We know that China is not our ally in reducing drug overdose deaths in the United States. Not only are they the precursor chemicals sourced from China, but money laundering organizations operating out of China have partnered with the cartels to launder the proceeds of their death and destruction at a fraction of the cost as before. We need to know what this administration is doing to combat the aggression from China and expose the Chinese Communist Party's complicity in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans. I'm also alarmed at the increasing presence of xylazine in the drug supply, which Director Gupta has classified as an emerging threat. I'm particularly concerned that Narcan cannot save someone from overdosing on it. We need to know how this illicit drug is making its way into the supply chain and what authorities ONDCP is leveraging to respond to this emerging threat. Our oversight in this matter is critical not just to ensuring that federal programs are working as intended, but this hearing will also inform authorization of that office beyond fiscal year 2023. ONDCP was last authorized by the Bipartisan Support Act in 2018. And a lot has changed in that time. But our resolve to put an end to the daily drug overdose tragedies in our communities has only strengthened. As the Committee of Jurisdiction over ONDCP, it's up to us to make sure that ONDCP is equipped and directed to take all appropriate actions to fight this crisis. And with that, I yield to Ranking Member Raskin for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Comer, and thank you, Director Gupta, for joining us today. The committee is going to be facing in the coming weeks the reauthorization of your office, which plays a critical role in the executive branch coordinating a whole-of-government response to reduce drug addiction and to prevent overdoses, which touch nearly every family and certainly every community in the country. Overdose deaths have reached record levels in recent years, and while deaths remain shockingly too high, we are making progress reducing their frequency, partially because of the work of your office. Without ONDCP's coordination and oversight of drug policy and strategy, our public health and law enforcement agencies would still be working myopically in silos, and federal investments to tackle the problem, totaling $41 billion in fiscal year 2022 alone, would be drained off into waste and inefficiency. Instead, because of your office, our federal agencies collaborate to address the problems of addiction and overdose as part of a well-focused national drug control strategy. This comprehensive approach means that we can better deploy federal resources to help the communities hit hardest by trafficking and the staggering rates of addiction, including by working to keep drugs out of the hands of children and to make sure people experiencing overdoses have access to life-saving overdose reversal medication. After rising for more than 2 decades, overdose deaths in America skyrocketed to historic highs during the coronavirus pandemic, when they increased by more than 30% in 2020. The rate of increase slowed to 15% in 2021 and then again in 2022. While overdoses remain far too common and a single overdose is too many for our people, we have made remarkable strides in the last year, and new CDC data show opioid overdose rates plateauing for the first time in many, many years. But we cannot continue this progress without reauthorizing your office. Democrats and Republicans should work together to address the underlying causes of addiction in our society. When we talk about the opioid crisis or the fentanyl crisis, we're really talking about many different social crises bearing down upon us, including the mental and emotional health crisis, and in many communities and regions, an economic and opportunity crisis. It does no service to our communities and our families harmed by addiction to completely blame opioid overdoses on a crisis, whether real or fake, at the southern border. We're talking about more than 40 million people in America who have substance use disorders, with many of them facing serious underlying mental health conditions. We're talking about people who lack the resources they need to treat mental illness, who face stigma in obtaining treatment, and who may self-medicate with alcohol, fentanyl, and other illicit drugs. More than 100,000 of our constituents, family members, and friends lost their lives to drug overdose last year. We must reauthorize ONDCP to ensure that America's young people have access to treatment, both for substance use disorders and other mental illnesses, so they do not end up overdosing or going to prison for committing drug-related crimes. More than 60% of children who experience depression do not get the treatment they need, which exposes them then to the temptation to use dangerous substances to self-medicate in the absence of the mental health support networks that could actually see them through to safety. We have to reauthorize your office to halt the flow of fentanyl into our country. Thanks to the work of ONDCP and the entire administration, U.S. Customs and Border Protection seized nearly 245,000 pounds of illicit drugs at the southern border, including 21,000 pounds of illegal fentanyl from March 2022 through February 23. Because we now have a coordinated all-of-government response, we're seizing more fentanyl before it invades our communities, and we're ensuring that law enforcement agencies have the tools they need to arrest illicit drug traffickers. We are disrupting the criminal cartel networks that operate from China to Mexico and have denied nearly $2 billion to the manufacturers and traffickers. Under ONDCP's leadership, the High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Areas Program is working effectively, and in 2022, we saw a return on investment of $82 for every dollar put into the program. The office is working with our Homeland Security agencies to ramp up the use of high-tech device drug detection technology along the southern border, including installing new non-invasive scanners to catch trucks entering with fentanyl into the country. These new technologies appear to be working in dramatic fashion because fentanyl seizures are up nearly 400% along the southern border, and 90% of illicit fentanyl is now being caught at ports of entry and vehicle checkpoints. Earlier this month, your office released the nation's first response plan for fentanyl adulterated with xylazine. After designating the substance an emerging threat, ONDCP would not have been able to make this designation without new authorities granted to you during reauthorization in 2018. Because of the new designation, ONDCP can coordinate a rapid response to the drug by surging resources to state and local entities combating the threat in real time at street level. We cannot efficiently address the addiction and illicit drug control problems we face without discussing both supply and demand. While blocking fentanyl, methamphetamine, and other dangerous drugs from entering America is crucially important, we must also address the prevalence of untreated mental illness and rampant drug use, which create a market for these drugs in the first place. And significantly, we must also ensure that people who experience drug overdose can get access to the emergency medications they need to save their lives. Thanks to the bipartisan, bicameral work of this committee and others in Congress, the naloxone and opioid overdose reversal medication is set to be available over the counter in just a few weeks. And thanks to the good work of your office, more of our schools and workplaces have overdose reversal medication readily available. We must continue our work to ensure these medications remain affordable and accessible, where they can mean the difference between life and death for our constituents. Dr. Gupta, I look forward to hearing from you today about your critical work, and I thank you for joining us for this hearing as we work to reauthorize your office. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I'm very pleased to introduce our witness today. Dr. Rahul Gupta is the Director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, which leads and coordinates the nation's drug control policy. Dr. Gupta was confirmed by the Senate and assumed office on November 5th, 2021. Look forward to hearing from Director Gupta today on his office's efforts to combat the overdose crisis, as well as the reauthorization of the Office of National Drug Control Policy. Pursuant to Committee Rule 9G, the witness will please stand and raise his right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony that you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show that the witness answered in the affirmative. We appreciate you being here today and look very forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witness that we have read your written statement and it will appear in full in the hearing record. Please limit your oral statement to 5 minutes. As a reminder, please press the button on the microphone in front of you so that it is on and the members can hear you. When you begin to speak, the light in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, it will turn yellow. You know the routine. You've done it before. And if you need to take more time, feel free. I recognize Dr. Gupta to please begin his opening statement.
Chairman Comer, Ranking Member Raskin, and members of the committee, thank you for having me here today. I recently called a mother to express my condolences. She just lost her daughter, Michelle, to drug overdose. Michelle left behind 2 young children. Michelle wasn't the only one lost to drug overdose and poisoning in the family. Her sister, Maya, had passed away 3 years prior after becoming addicted to pain medications prescribed to her. And the mother I spoke to had been the one to find Maya unresponsive at home. Every parent's worst nightmare. So I asked myself, how could we as a nation have saved these 2 young women and more than 109,000 other Americans over the past year? Some say we just need to lock up everyone involved with illicit drugs, including people like Michelle and Maya. Just lock them up and throw away the keys. Others say we should focus on treatment and ignore drug traffickers. With an American dying every 5 minutes around the clock, we can't just focus on supply or just on demand. We gotta do both, because we cannot treat dead people. So here's the bottom line. Drug trafficking is a crime and must be prosecuted, and drug addiction is a disease that must be treated. And here's what we're contending with today. Drug traffickers who are motivated only by profit, too few support systems for people with the disease of substance use disorder. These drugs are accessible right on your phone. And emerging threats of fentanyl mixed with xylazine, commonly known as tranq, has made matters worse. Tranq dope is making fentanyl look like a walk in the park. Disrupting today's drug traffickers and producers is like playing whack-a-mole. The global supply chain for synthetic drugs is more robust than ever, with precursors predominantly coming from China, which refuses to cooperate on counter-narcotics. So we're bringing world leaders together to address the global supply of precursor chemicals for synthetic drugs with or without China. Last fall, Congress itself put a price tag on the staggering toll of opioid epidemic. $1.5 trillion in 2020 alone, $1.5 trillion. So this is a national security problem, it's an economic prosperity problem, and it's a public health problem. And President Biden and his administration are determined to solve it. The President's National Drug Control Strategy is going after the two key drivers of this crisis: untreated addiction and drug trafficking profits that fuel it. And we're getting results. Let me give you an example. El Chapo's son is behind bars, and naloxone or Narcan is over the counter. And treatment for addiction is more accessible than it's ever been. We have the technology, the expertise, and the courage to stop drugs at the border. When almost 90% of fentanyl is coming through our ports of entry, we must put technology to work for the American people. I want to point your attention to the poster on my left. We're installing new high-tech drug detection scanners on our southwest border to make sure that every single vehicle that needs to be scanned gets scanned, every single one. This is what commercial disruption of drug trafficking looks like in the 21st century. If you look at the poster to my right, these images show from side to side and top to bottom how technology is helping seize more fentanyl than ever before. All the pieces in the red, circled. With record-breaking seizures, we've denied traffickers more than $22 billion in profit just last year, thanks largely to the brave officers and agents of Customs and Border Protection and our High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Areas Program, or HIDTA. At the same time, we've invested $83 billion in treatment, 42% more than the previous administration, to address the opioid crisis in local communities. We're tracking non-fatal overdoses in near real time so communities can respond to hotspots. And using the Emerging Threats Authority granted by Congress in the SUPPORT Act, we've developed the federal response to xylazine and are implementing it as we speak. Our Drug-Free Community Support Program, or DFC, is preventing youth substance use in all 50 states. And our social media campaign warning youth about the dangers of fentanyl and the importance of carrying naloxone has made more than 1.7 billion impressions, 1.7 billion. And as a result of all these actions and so many more, our nation is finally seeing progress. In 2022, overdose deaths flattened after sharp rises for several years. Still, we cannot stop. We must keep pushing forward. Now, to President Biden and to me, the path is clear. We must double down on what works and address the challenges that remain to save American lives. And we must prepare for future threats. I want to thank Congress for your role in the progress our nation has made, and I'm eager to work with you to make sure that law enforcement and public health have the tools that they need. But make no mistake about it, this is a fight for the very future of our nation. The American people deserve nothing less than our very best. Thank you.
Thank you, and we will now begin our questioning phase. Chair recognizes Mr. Gosar of Arizona for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Gupta, for your comments. 107,000 people died of overdoses in 2021, as you said. It appears 109,000 people died of overdoses from February of 2022 to 2023. No matter how the administration spins this, the problem's getting worse. There are many reasons for the drug crisis. Instead of dependency that we saw on drugs, now we're seeing trank and fentanyl being put together, and we're seeing instant death. Yes, there are more granular policy fixes that are worthy of focus. However, I would like to zoom out on this one problem. Biden's national drug control strategy is 150 pages. The words God and faith are not mentioned one time. People need a purpose to be happy. To quote Robert F. Kennedy, I know that's awful hard, quote, unemployment kills, end of quote. The left offers endless benefits. In other words, dependency, because dependent population votes for the providers of those benefits. But a human being needs a purpose, a good job, the ability to provide for a family, a belief in a creator in order to be happy. He or she doesn't need lockdowns and destroy their small businesses. He or she doesn't need free needles and syringes so they can inject themselves with deadly drugs. He or she doesn't need lower wages and more crime to thank illegal and alien invasion. That only raises anxiety. He or she doesn't need to fight in pointless foreign wars. Words related to race are mentioned 50 times in this same document. Racism and white supremacy have nothing to do with the fact that our population is being decimated by illegal drugs and high rates of suicide. The lack of purpose fostered by the left is the real culprit. Now I've got some questions for you. I'd first like to submit for the record the following article by the heritage immigration expert Laura Rise. Quote, deception, numbers, and word games are hiding continued mass illegal immigration, post Title 42. For the record. In January of 2023, the administration decided to abuse the parole system, which only allows illegal aliens to enter the United States on a case-by-case basis for urgent humanitarian reasons or public benefit, by allowing 30,000 Haitians, Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans to arrive per month. Dr. Gupta, does the decision to allow 30,000 individuals from these very poor countries to enter the U.S. every month exacerbate or improve the drug crisis in the United States?
Thank you, Congressman. I will say that the levels have flattened. We need to do more. We need to create a recovery-ready nation, recovery-ready businesses, as you mentioned, and we need to have people find hope and purpose in their life. And we're taking all aspects of it. You mentioned faith. We are meeting with faith leaders across the nation very soon next month.
But I don't see it published. It's
sorry.
one thing to say that you're meeting with these people, but it's another thing to be acknowledged, right?
I can tell you that this is an important piece of what we're trying to do, is accomplish or bring all communities together, whether they're business, faith, treatment, public health, or public safety, law enforcement. It is important. All of us have a role to play. None of us can fix this problem by themselves.
I agree.
We recognize that.
But allowing thousands of people who do not speak English and who will have a very hard time finding a job to enter the United States will exacerbate the crisis in the United States. But that's not all. The Biden administration is bastardizing the use of federal app originally created by the Trump administration to facilitate cross-border tourism and commerce under the Trump administration, called the CBP One app. That allows illegal aliens to make an asylum appointment at a port of entry. 37,500 illegal aliens can enter the U.S. per month. According to RISE, if aliens entering through the Parole and CBP One app were added to the DHS official encounters numbers, then encounters would return to historic levels of 200,000 plus per month, numbers only seen under the Biden administration. Do you believe facilitating the entry of 37,500 aliens per month, many of whom do not speak English and will have a very hard time finding a job, will exacerbate or improve the drug crisis in the United States?
Thank you, Congressman. What we're trying to do is put technology at the border to make sure that where the drugs are coming through, we're stopping every piece of that drug that we can stop.
But you're not, because I'm from Arizona, and we see hundreds and thousands of pounds of fentanyl coming across the border. So no matter how you try to intercept it, it's going to make it worse. So I got limited time. The National Drug Control Strategy published by your office says advancing racial equity is one of the 7 priorities that your office deems to be most important in fighting the drug crisis. Another is harm reduction, which means facilitating drug use for drug abusers. How is Congress supposed to take your office seriously when you espouse such positions? I don't know how any of these have anything to do with those circumstances. Mr. Chairman, I yield back, and I thank you for the time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Raskins from Maryland, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm surprised to hear my colleague from Arizona say some of the things he's saying. First of all, the purpose of our government is laid out very clearly in the preamble of the Constitution. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and preserve to ourselves and our posterity the blessings of liberty, ordain the Constitution. The gentleman is somehow looking for some kind of religious test, which is explicitly forbidden in the Constitution of people for public office in the drug control strategy? What about the free exercise clause? What about the establishment clause of the Constitution, which says that the Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion? So surely it can make a difference in terms of people's individual lives and individual paths to recovery. People will derive sources of strength from many different places, including religious faith, including their friends and their family, including psychology and so on. But the idea that our drug strategy is flawed because it doesn't put religion at the center seems to me to be preposterous. And the gentleman also said no matter how you try to intercept it, it's going to make it worse. On the contrary, what I've heard from Dr. Gupta is that the new technologies of interception are working in order to reduce the flow of fentanyl into the country. Dr. Gupta, you say in the National Drug Control Strategy, saving lives is our North Star. What are you doing to save lives and prevent overdoses, and how does this differ from what was happening before?
Thank you, Congressman, Ranking Member, for that question. It is really important we meet people where they are today because of the crisis. One of those things is to make sure that we have naloxone or Narcan available to people when they're overdosing. As a doctor, I've seen people come into the emergency room 5 times sometimes in the same day. I've not judged them, but I do feel that saving that life was important to me. Make sure that they have a chance at getting into treatment. We're expanding treatment with telehealth, with expanding the ability. Congress was instrumental in making sure removing the X waiver that now goes from 129,000 doctors to almost 2 million doctors in this country. And then we're making sure that we're putting technology. I was down in Arizona, saw a 445% increase in detection. 38 million pills is what Customs Border Protection told me down there at the border.
So you're saying that the technology is working?
It is absolutely working.
That your strategies of interception are not failing, and we shouldn't surrender to the fatalism which says there's nothing that can be done about it other than everybody go home and pray about it. How are you addressing mental illness as an underlying cause of substance abuse?
Thank you, Ranking Member. Mental illness and drug addiction go hand in glove, and they overlap with each other. And it is really important that we address both the mental health, social isolation, as well as addiction as piece of that. Just yesterday, the President announced the importance of parity, or day before yesterday, the importance of parity enforcement to make sure that people with physical health and mental health get the same level of care and not discriminated against. That's one of the reasons for not getting Americans the help they need, and the President is completely focused on that.
I read a fascinating article that I want to submit to the record, Mr. Chairman, called How to Stop the Mexican Cartels, Stop Supplying Them with Guns. And it makes the point that 75 to 90% of Mexican drug cartel firearms come from U.S. manufacturers and U.S. gun stores. As I understand it, there's only one gun store in all of Mexico. There's a much stricter control on firearms there. And the firearms that are being used by the cartels that are pumping fentanyl into our country are armed by American gun manufacturers. Would we actually be striking a blow for our efforts to reduce the flow of fentanyl into our country if we reduce the flow of firearms into Mexico coming from our gun dealers?
Ranking Member, it's critical to have a strong, stable partner on the south of the border. Part of that's to address the illegal weapons that are going on, smuggled down into Mexico, causing violence as part of the drug and other trades.
20,000 Mexicans were killed last year. They're killing thousands of people, these syndicates and these cartels, and they're getting their guns from America.
Ranking Member, the cooperation on this issue and as well as the drug issue has never been stronger in terms of making sure that the governor of Mexico is holding accountable both the traffickers, but also we're sharing data, E-track and other systems so that we can go after the weapons trafficking that is happening in this country as well.
Well, thank you very much, and I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you kindly.
Chair now recognizes Dr. Fox from North Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Gupta, for being here today. I voted in favor of the Support Act in 2018, which created the ONDCP, and I believe Pardon me. Pardon me. Oh. Let me start all over again, if I might. I voted in favor of the Support Act in 2018, which created the ONDCP, and I believe in the work that you and your staff do to marshal our government's resources to keep dangerous drugs like fentanyl and xylene off of our streets. However, I'm deeply concerned that the Biden administration is pursuing radical open border policies that invite cartels and their Chinese enablers to flood our country with absurd amounts of fatal drugs, making the ONDCP's job even harder than it ought to be. Dr. Gupta, can you tell the committee how many pounds of fentanyl were seized in fiscal year 2020?
Congressman, I can get you the exact data for years, but the fact is we're seizing more fentanyl now than ever before. And
I believe the official CBP data shows it's 5,600 pounds. So can you tell us how many pounds were seized in fiscal year 2021?
It was certainly less than what we have now.
It's 11,201 pounds. I'm using official figures. Fiscal year 2022, 14,700 pounds. And this year, and I'll remind those watching that we still have a few more months to go in fiscal 2023, 22,037 pounds. We've seized nearly 17,000 pounds more fentanyl in 2023 than we did in 2020. That's just a difference of 3 years. Dr. Gupta, could you please inform the committee just how little fentanyl is needed to kill the average size man?
Congressman, as little as 2 milligrams is potentially lethal, but I could tell you there's 2 reasons primarily for seizing high numbers. One is the use of technology that we're doing, and our brave women and men of the Customs Border Protection are working, officers in blue and green, to stop it. And the second is to make sure that these drug traffickers and producers are being motivated by profits.
Well, we very much appreciate the work that's being done to seize the fentanyl. My understanding was it takes 3 milligrams. You said 2, so my math will be off on 2, but let me say on 3 milligrams, the 22,037 pounds of fentanyl seized so far this year is enough to kill over 3 billion people. 3 billion people. So under your numbers, it would be even more. That's nearly half the global population. So we learned in a hearing hosted by this very committee in late April that Chinese firms produce and sell the chemical precursors used in fentanyl production to South American cartels, who in turn manufacture and traffic fentanyl across the southern border using the flow of migrants as a smokescreen. Dr. Gupta, I want to inform both you and the public that in 2020, our southern border saw some 242,000 encounters with illegal immigrants. I should note that these are the encounters that were recorded and that the true number is much higher. And so far in 2023, there have been a whopping 783,993 encounters. That's over 3 times higher than in 2020. And while I appreciate the good work that you and the people who work with you are doing, it is very clear to me and most Americans that this president's open border policies are contributing to the deaths of thousands of American citizens and lining the pockets of drug cartels and illicit Chinese drug manufacturers. This is a disgrace. Mr. Chairman, Congress must act. I yield.
Will the gentlelady yield for just a moment?
My time is up, Mr. Raskin.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Norton from Washington, D.C. for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this important hearing. Dr. Gupta, I think you'd probably agree that the opioid epidemic is one of the greatest public health crises facing our nation today. Lack of access to treatment, and I'm interested in my questions on treatment, is a primary driver of this crisis. In 2021, 24 million people in the United States aged 12 years and older met the scientific criteria for having a substance use disorder, but the vast majority did not receive treatment. Dr. Gupta, are medications to treat opioid addiction effective?
Yes, Congressman.
And are most health insurance plans required by law to cover medications for substance abuse disorders?
Yes, they do, minus sometimes the games that get played about pre-authorization and other aspects of this that we are trying to address at this point.
That's important. There is no reason people should face continued barriers to treatment, but tragically they do. For example, a recent study indicates that Medicaid is one of the primary payers for medication that helps treat opioid addiction in the United States, also known as therapeutics. However, 50% of Medicaid enrollees with opioid use disorder still lack access to therapeutics. Dr. Gupta, based on your knowledge and expertise as a medical doctor, why is it important that people who experience opioid use disorder have access to medicines that help treat the disorder?
Thank you, Congresswoman. It is critical. We have less than 1 out of 10 people who need treatment today is getting treatment. It is worse for communities that are marginalized, communities of color, and rural populations. So it's important that when we look at telehealth, we look at being able to cover for these medications. There are 3 FDA-approved medications that people get the help when and where they need it. And that's exactly the work that this administration is trying to do, expand it to have the goal of universal access to treatment by 2025.
Thank you. Just last week, the Biden-Harris administration announced plans to distribute almost $48 million in grant funding for programs that expand access to medications for opioid use disorder. This was part of the administration's overdose prevention strategy and its coordinated whole-of-government approach to making opioid addiction treatment more accessible. So, Dr. Gupta, how would these grants help ensure people experiencing opioid use disorder have access to treatment, including therapeutics such as buprenorphine?
Thank you, Congresswoman. The fact is that today there's $24 billion more that are going into local communities than in the past 4 years. So for the reason for that, $83 billion in total is to get people the help where they need it and when they need it. These monies will help people access treatment. And one of the things that I will say is oftentimes people don't ask for treatment because of stigma. So it's important that we start to work to remove that stigma, whether we're working with employers, small businesses, or others. And that's an important piece of this work, to make sure that people can access it. They don't have the fear of being punished for that, and then treatments are available and accessible to them wherever they live.
Thank you. Dr. Gupta, how would reauthorizing the Office of National Drug Control Policy allow you to continue coordinating across government agencies so that people have access to opioid use disorder medications regardless of socioeconomic status or other barriers to care?
Congresswoman, what my office does is works across the $40+ billion budget across 19 federal agencies to coordinate the response to this. It's a congressionally created office. It is critical to saving lives that we make sure that treatment is available to anyone and everyone that needs it. It is an important tool in the toolbox to be able to help people save lives.
Substance use disorders are incredibly complex challenges that require multifaceted solutions. I look forward to continuing to work with the administration to get life-saving treatment into the hands of people struggling with opioid use disorder.
Would the gentlelady yield for a moment?
I yield.
Just a quick question on Ms. Fox's point. Does an increase in the amount of fentanyl seized indicate the failure of our drug strategy or the success of the policies of the administration?
Ranking Member, it obviously increased seizures means that more is being done at the border to hold people accountable. So it is an indication of the success of the policy and the strategy.
Thank you. Yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Palmer from Alabama for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. In response to what our measure of success ought to be, we had a record number of people die from fentanyl poisoning last year. It exceeded another record year the previous year, and I think if we want to talk success in dealing with fentanyl, particularly fentanyl crossing our southern border, I'm very appreciative of the fact that we've interdicted an enormous amount of it, but when the death rate is as high as it is, Dr. Gupta, with all due respect, that's not exactly success by anyone's definition. I want to ask you about something else. We also are seeing something, and I appreciate the fact that ONDCP has alerted the public about the use of xylazine, also known as tranq. It's, as you know, a non-opioid veterinary tranquilizer. It's not approved for human use. It depresses the central nervous system, and we're starting to see people to die from that. I just saw a report the other day with a young mother talking about her son. They tried to administer Narcan to revive him. That didn't work because it's non-opioid. And I just want to ask you, where is most of the xylazine produced?
A lot of it, thank you, Congressman, for the question. A lot of it's coming from illicit sources from China.
Right.
It's also being trafficked through traffickers and mixed on the street.
You're ahead of me on where I was going with this, because I want to make this point, Mr. Chairman, that it isn't enough for the cartels and the Chinese to kill Americans with fentanyl. We've developed some ways to save people who've taken that drug with Narcan. But Narcan doesn't work, as we pointed out, and Dr. Gupta knows this. It's a non-opioid. The xylazine is, and it doesn't work. So now they're mixing it in with fentanyl. And I just have to ask myself, and this is probably unfair for me to ask you this, but it seems to me, Dr. Gupta, that this is intentional. That, I mean, most people, when they're selling a product, they want to preserve their customer base, but it seems to me that the intent here is to kill as many Americans as they can.
Congressman, the intention is to make as much money as they can. Adding xylazine, I will say this, Narcan or naloxone does work, but it complicates the response. So you got to have more respiratory control and all of those things. It's making it difficult to save lives because of the tranq dope now. But the intent here is all about money. We've got to follow the money, and that's exactly what this administration is doing.
Well, if it was all about money, they would be producing a drug that gave the same results that the drug user wants to experience without killing them. But when you have over 100,000 people dying, there's a problem here. And I'm almost to a point, Mr. Chairman, where I think that the cartels ought to be classified as non-state adversaries. I'm serious. I mean, when you have that many people dying, and I bet there's not a person in this room that doesn't know someone who's lost a family member to a drug overdose.
Congressman, what they're trying to do, if you allow me to say this, is this is collateral damage that's acceptable to them and is not to us. This is what they're trying to do. They try to make sure that fentanyl is 50 to 100 times more potent and addictive than morphine. So their goal is to get as much as possible to the people, and not just in the United States, but across the world. So their population and clients is limitless, and we want to make sure we can stop them by denying them profits and operating capital and do everything we can.
But don't we also know that the Chinese are providing not only the xylazine and the fentanyl, but also the chemicals for mixing these, for the combinations that they need to produce the drugs that people are taking?
We are doing everything to ask Chinese to work. They're refusing to cooperate with us at this point. That's why we've put together a global coalition of 80-plus countries and 11 international organizations to go after the chemical precursors across the
Well,
world.
when they're refusing to work with you, I don't think China needs the drug money. They're not making the money that the cartels are making. So at some point, you have to realize that there's a level of intent here, of malevolence, that has to be taken into account. And I think we're going to have to I know Congressman Dan Crenshaw is involved with this select committee on dealing with the cartels, but when you have over 100,000 people dying, and that's probably underreported by 10–15% because so many families don't want it on the death certificate how their family member died. I think we're going to have to reevaluate how we address this, and it needs to be a bipartisan effort. And I thank you for being here. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Frost from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Dr. Gupta, for being here. The Office of National Drug Control Policy is responsible for coordinating the United States drug control policy response. This includes policies addressing the flow of harmful drugs into the country, but also includes supporting our neighbors who are directly impacted by substance use disorder. And also to clarify, the ONDCP has been around since 1989. Once again, the ONDCP has been around since 1989. It was reauthorized in 2018. So it was not founded in 2018, it was in 1989. Each year in Florida, around 750,000 people misuse prescription pain relievers, and 165,000 live with an opioid use disorder. And it gets worse. In America, approximately 85% of the prison population has an active substance use disorder or were incarcerated in connection with drugs or drug use. Forced withdrawal in prison can be deadly. Doctor, how has your office supported the expansion of substance use treatment for incarcerated folks?
Thank you, Congressman, for that important question. The fact is today that any given day there's 2 million Americans incarcerated. 60 to 80% of them are incarcerated because of either drug use or drug-related crime. And when they are released, they're up to 120 times more likely to die from overdose or be reincarcerated. It is so critical becomes to get people the help they need, to get them treatment, so when they come out, that not only 85% less likely to die, but actually go back and assimilate in the community and be contributing members to the community. So we are both working within the Federal Bureau of Prisons to expand treatment, so anyone who wants treatment is offered treatment. We're also providing Medicaid waivers to states. 15 states have already applied for the waivers to get treatment available for 90 days before release. 2 have been approved, including California and Washington, which I believe was just approved last week.
Okay, thank you. And you brought this up. It's not just during incarceration. The first 2 weeks someone is out of jail, they are 129 times more likely to overdose.
Congressman, here's the problem. We have 18 to 42 years old. Number 1 cause of death today in America, this is working age population, is overdose. And these folks are being released and they're dying. I look at this also from an economic prosperity and a future for a country standpoint. And this is this is not a 1 year or 2 year project. This is something we will continue to see results into the future.
Has your office developed recommendations on dealing with overdose in terms of reentry?
Yes, Congressman, we have developed a state model law for prisons and jails to look at how to measure, because we want to make sure the taxpayer dollars are being appropriately used to measure what works, what doesn't work as well. And we'll be happy to share.
I also want to hear what you have to say about the CMS 1115 waiver. Can you explain for people what that is and why it's so important?
Yes, Congressman. As I mentioned, the numbers do not lie. We have too many Americans dying that are being released back in the community because their threshold goes down and they go back and they end up dying, or worse, in being incarcerated. The 1115 waiver allows states to apply for the ability to treat people for 90 days before they are released. And then the most important piece of this is connecting. Oftentimes when people are released, they're lost in the community. Next time they know, either they're in prison or they're dead. This connection, transition of care is so important that this waiver allows. It's literally life-saving and life-changing for these individuals.
And as I understand it, my home state of Florida is not yet among the states making use of the waiver. Is that correct?
In my understanding as well.
In 2022, the National Drug Control Strategy, you outlined specific goals and field performance goals for 2025. How confident are you that if given that amount of resources needed, that you can hit those targets that you've set for yourself?
These are goals that we've outlined of saving 165,000 American lives by 2025 are doable. But just between 22 and 21, we have averted the death of 19,000 Americans. Again, to me as a doctor, every one of these is an individual that is at the dinner table, at the holiday party, with each other, with their family. So we have that. The goals, I think we're putting together, the policy that are there are working. We need to make sure they're resourced and folks get the help that they need.
Thank you. You know, I think the chair and my colleagues on this committee on both sides of the aisle can agree that the size of our commitment should match the size of the challenge. And this is a huge challenge for our country right now. Thank you. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Higgins from Louisiana for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doctor, your background, you're primarily a medical doctor, correct?
Yes, Congressman.
Okay, so you're not considered, you consider yourself a law enforcement professional?
Congressman, I worked in West Virginia with law enforcement as Commissioner of Health for 2 governors, as well as local health
We
officers.
appreciate that service. I'm not trying to do anything other than clarify your background, the position you're in as our nation faces an unprecedented crisis of incoming deadly drugs across our southern border. It's going to call for a great deal of coordination between the executive branch and your particular department, which we have to determine if we intend to support reauthorization or not, and I'm not there yet. So as a law enforcement professional myself, I have questions about the direction that you're leading your department. And so I'm asking you legitimately, it's okay to be a doctor and not a cop, but when you're talking to folks about who you are you a doctor or are you a cop?
I'm proud to be a physician, but also have tremendous respect for the law enforcement officers across this nation.
Excellent and polished answer. So as the meetings that you have, how would you describe how extensive they are, the meetings that you have with the heads at CBP and Homeland Security investigations?
I have regular meetings with all of the agencies and more, as you mentioned, and there are...
Specifically CBP and Homeland Security investigations. How frequently? You say regular meetings. What's that mean?
Congressman, I just had a phone call this week with the acting commissioner, Troy Miller of CBP, and I intend to see him again next week.
How about HSI?
It's more or less, I have detailees in my office every single day. They come to work from HSI, from CBP, from a number of law enforcement agencies.
Okay, let's shift from your level of interaction with the leading Department of Homeland Security, law enforcement, and investigative forces at our border that are tasked with stopping the fentanyl from coming into our country and the meth. You familiar with the term China white? You know what that it was back in the 90s? That's not a trick question, I'll just tell you. When fentanyl first showed up on the street, we didn't know what it was. It was very rarely encountered. It was called China white. It was known to be super powerful and deadly. But it wasn't really an issue because the issue at the time, in the 90s and into the mid-2000s, was meth labs in America. Those were largely shut down by legislative action taken at the federal and state level to take Sudafed and Sudafed-type products off the shelf, make them only available over the counter, but with an ID through the pharmacy. That pretty much shut down the labs. But this vacuum was filled as the fentanyl trafficking began building, and it coming through Mexico. We knew this. And this stuff was so deadly, and I'm trying to get there, was so deadly, it was killing our canine dogs and officers who had come into contact with it. We had to change all our protocols on how to deal with this stuff. And now, it's so prevalent and so cheap, $100 to $150 a gram, and only requires 2 milligrams as that's a deadly dose. It's called a point on the street because you pick it up with the point of a pen. This is how deadly it is. and it's so cheap and so readily available, drug dealers are giving it away in order to establish an addicted clientele, to grow the addicted clientele. They're giving it away. We had 107,000 deaths in 2021, 108,000 in 2022, and your quote from earlier, good sir, was that you are not failing to intercept. So please explain.
Thank you, Congressman. And let me just be clear that I was involved in putting pseudoephedrine behind the walls. I was involved in those meth lab busts on the ground, actually. And the reason, if you think about it, why it went south of the border, the production of meth, is because of money. The reason that fentanyl is so profitable is because the small amounts, it affects the same amount and is so potent. So I think we have to understand what persuades these bad guys to actually go to the verge of killing 109,000 Americans a year. And it's actually profits, it's money. It's important, and this is why this administration is going through commercial disruption, going after the traffickers, but also their profits, pill pressers, dye molds, shippers, and working with shippers and express consignment carriers, and putting highest level of sanctions that we have on both Chinese companies, these companies, as well as the Mexican cartels, and producing the indictment along with arrests of hundreds and hundreds of the members in recent days that you have seen. Part of that all reason is to disrupt and dismantle these organizations, but also understand what drives them in the 21st century.
You've been very professional. My time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Ms. Stansberry from New Mexico for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Dr. Gupa, welcome to our committee. Mr. Chairman, I want to start by thanking you sincerely for convening this panel today, and I do mean that from the bottom of my heart because I've watched as this committee has devolved into a platform for conspiracy theories and misinformation and political theater over the last 6 months, and I think it's notable that many of our colleagues don't even bother to show up when we hold a real hearing and the conspiracy theories and cameras are not rolling. So it's about high time that we actually turn to an issue that affects the American people. And I think like so many Americans, these issues of addiction, of drug trafficking, weigh heavy on my heart, especially for so many New Mexicans, which is the state that I represent. The opioid crisis has hit close to home. And in fact, I will never forget the morning in January in 2019 when I received the first call. I was actually sitting on the floor of the New Mexico State House of Representatives. I had just been elected to the legislature when I received the call that one of my oldest and dearest friends had died suddenly of a heart attack. We later learned that it was a fentanyl overdose. And over the years that have now come since that first call, there have been more. And I think for many New Mexicans, this is a story that is all too familiar. And it is why I have spent a lot of my time in this body working on real solutions to address the fentanyl crisis. Because it's real. Because it hits close to home. Because it's affecting every single family in our communities and in my state. And we can sit here and yell about the border and talk about all of these issues, but if we're not actually addressing the real issues that are leading to the crisis, then our family members and our friends are going to continue to die. That's why I've been working with law enforcement, our state, local, and tribal officials, our behavioral health providers to help rebuild the behavioral health and addiction recovery systems that were gutted by a Republican governor just one cycle ago. We're working to invest in the drug interdiction programs, the drug trafficking technologies and tools for our law enforcement. We're helping to support the border intervention programs that help to stop the tide of those raw materials coming in, and actually helping those, whether they're in the homes of their family members or loved ones or living on the streets, actually connect with the care that they need to recover. That's how we address this crisis. Not sitting in rooms screaming to cameras. And so, Dr. Gupta, I'm grateful for your service, and I know that you understand that. And I'm grateful that President Biden has actually made this a priority and a centerpiece of his administration. And I think in spite of what we've heard here today, it's important that the American people really understand that. And I wonder if you could just take a moment to help us understand how high a priority this is for the president and for your office, and how you are addressing the crisis.
Thank you, Congresswoman, and I am deeply sorry for the loss. It is something that stays with me every day. Every morning I wake up, this is something I think about. So this is very personal to me. The president is extremely committed to this. I can tell you that this is his top priority. Not only is the president's drug control strategy completely data-driven and focused on getting resources and help to Americans, and in an evidence-based manner, doing everything we can from both supply side and demand side, but he's personally committed. I spoke to him this week about this. This is how much committed he is, and so is the vice president. We brought in 8 attorneys general last week to the White House to talk about it, and it's important, it's bipartisan, it's part of the president's unity agenda, and it is something that when 109,000, 1 million Americans have passed away in the last 2 decades, and tens of millions have suffered a non-fatal overdose, I think we've got to find a way to work together on this and solve this problem.
Thank you, Doctor. I also want to just take a moment to clarify and correct some misinformation that was shared just a few moments ago by one of my colleagues that is not only incorrect but dangerous. Now, Dr. Gupta, in New Mexico, our law enforcement are very clear with us. The vast majority of raw materials that is used for the manufacturing of fentanyl is actually coming across legal ports of entry. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the vast majority of those materials is actually being transported through those legal ports of entry by crime syndicates and drug traffickers, not by individuals who are seeking asylum in this country, correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. And, Dr. Gupta, and to my colleagues, I think that the propagation of dangerous rhetoric against those from other countries who are seeking asylum in our country not only threatens the lives of those individuals who are trying to come to our country for a better life, like so many of our families did, but it also threatens the safety of our communities and our ability to address this crisis. So let's be honest with the American people, let's be bipartisan, and let's actually work to solve this problem. And with that, I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Grofman from Wisconsin for 5 minutes.
First of all, I got to do a follow-up on that last thing, because I've been at the border several times. And if you talk to the Border Patrol, what they will tell you is the majority of drugs caught at the border are in designated points of entry. We have like 30,000 to well over 30,000 gotaways who come across the border when there's diversions made by the Mexican drug cartels. The gotaways, of course, we don't catch them with drugs because we don't catch them at all, right? And the guys on the ground, the guys with the Border Patrol believe that most of these drugs are coming through gotaways, but they don't show up in the statistics because they got away. And the reason they're getting away is there a lack of Border Patrol agents. So you should just be aware what the people on the ground think. Now, I think to look at this problem, we have to see who is doing these drugs, because that's where the problem is. I'm going to ask you some general questions about the 108,000 people or whatever died last year. Percentage-wise, how many of those folks about had full-time jobs?
I don't know if we have that level of details on data. I can tell you that when I did the same survey for West Virginia as a commissioner, we found that most of these people that did have jobs were blue-collar workers, and they were less than high school educated.
Okay, there's an interesting follow-up, but we don't know. Percentage-wise, what percentage of the people who died are married?
I can tell you, Congressman, that this problem cuts across all.
No, I know, and I know it affects everybody, and there are examples in any area. But if we want to reduce the number of people dying, we got to look at where most of the people die. And when we look at the people who aren't dying, maybe we can get some suggestions how we can have the population as a whole take less of these drugs. Do we know percentage-wise the people who died about how much are married?
So, Congressman, if you want to get at stopping people from dying, we put up a non-fatal overdose platform for the whole state, the whole country at a county level. We can get that data, and that's available near real time right now.
Okay, so do you have data? Is it available?
It's publicly available. All the 911 call data is publicly available near real time. It is helping local communities right now.
Okay, so
Respond
you know what percentage are married and what percent are not?
We know who's getting overdosed, and we know how to respond to them and get them into treatment.
Okay, so of the percent overdosed, what percent have full-time jobs? Say, what percent are married? What percent are on antidepressants? These are all questions that I would be asking to see if we can identify how to prevent people from overdosing or what our target population should be. Are we collecting that data?
That data is sometimes is collected by individual states, but here's what I can tell you. There's individuals who go through a non-fatal overdose 14 times. There's 14-to-1 ratio in some places of it's like people are coming to the cliff to fall off, they're saved, until they're not saved and they fall off.
I understand, but you're not asking my question, which is frustrating because it means you don't know the answer to my question, which is frustrating because to me your job should be to know the answers to my questions. Now, I will ask you a question on this Narcan stuff. There are a variety of efforts being made to make Narcan more available. And it's amazing when you talk to your local law enforcement, the number of people who they've brought back compared to the number of people who have died. There's a bill that people are floating around out there saying that we should have Narcan in every federal building. Do we know where most people are dying? Are they dying in their bedroom? Are they dying in a car? What are the 5 most popular places that we find people dying?
Publicly, and let me tell you a very specific example. When you look at the teenagers doubling in deaths from poisonings from 2019 to 2021, in 2 out of 3 situations, bystanders were nearby, but naloxone or Narcan was not. And I'm talking about the youngest of in our country that we could have saved.
Okay, so you believe that if we were to put more Narcan available in the country, it would be places where are these people dying? Are they dying in a school setting? Are they dying out in a park at midnight? I mean, where are they dying?
Public places, public places. I would think about naloxone, Narcan like a smoke alarm or a defibrillator. The more it's available, the more lives will be saved, and the more publicly available. Schools, restaurants, businesses, malls, all of these places.
Okay, I know I'm a little bit over here, but I would ask you to find the answers to the questions I ask you. You know, because we should know if only 5% of the people are dying are married, that's an interesting statistic. Okay, if only 15% of the people are dying had a full-time job, that's an interesting statistic. If a lot of them are on antidepressants, that's an interesting statistic. And if you can't do a study nationwide, maybe you can just do a sample of a random 5,000 people, and the results might surprise you. And maybe we could use those results to partly solve this scourge. Thank you.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Lee from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank the committee for holding this hearing and giving us an opportunity to discuss this health crisis, because that's what addiction is, a health crisis. Dr. Gupta, last year when you described substance abuse disorder in your testimony before our committee, you stated, quote, "One of the things we realized in the last few decades is this is a brain disease. Just like a lot of other disease, it's a brain disease. The way that we need to treat that is as a disease of the brain. We need to continue the work started by the National Drug Control Strategy to act on this medical understanding and prioritize treatment for people struggling with substance abuse disorders, just as our society seeks to treat other forms of diseases. For example, the strategy aims to, quote, make evidence-based treatment as accessible and available as primary care. Dr. Gupta, how would achieving this goal benefit American families like those I represent in Pittsburgh?
Well, thank you, Congresswoman. Really important, because today when someone wants to get help at 2 a.m., They're told that they have to wait in a line for the next 30 days, and sometimes people are not even alive for that. What we are trying to do is to make sure, just like we treat in primary care, hypertension, high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, you name it, this is a problem that can be treated in primary care. This is the reason that we've extended telehealth, the ability for Americans to get the help no matter where they are. We made sure that people can take some of these medications home with them. We've removed, with the help of Congress, the X waiver. I'm an X waiver physician, but now we have expanded the ability for almost 2 million doctors to be able to treat, as opposed to 129,000. And we are committed to making medications more available and affordable as well. The president is fully committed on that, make sure that everyone gets the help that they need, when and where they need it.
Thank you, Dr. Gupta. And how is the ONDCP centering evidence-based solutions in response to the addiction crisis?
Thank you, Congressman. I think it's important to see for what it is. As you mentioned, it's a disease of the brain. We're also going beyond treatment, because the fact is there's 20 million plus Americans today successfully in recovery, 60% of whom are gainfully employed and often getting their health insurance from employment. So now we know that people need more than just treatment, need housing, transportation, food security. Those things are important to make sure that we're taking an approach that centers around success of each individual in their community, because that spells the success of the state and success of the nation.
Thank you for lifting up the holistic needs that we have in this in our struggle to treat this disorder. The need to prioritize treatment in our approach to drug control policy can't be overstated. Also, 94% of people with a substance abuse disorder did not receive any treatment in 2021. We're talking about the difference between life and death here, as overdoses have accounted for over 1 million deaths in the United States since 1999. How is ONDCP making treatment more accessible for people with complex needs who face barriers to care?
I think, thank you, Congresswoman. I think it's really important to make sure that we make treatment accessible and affordable to anyone and everyone that needs it. When we look at people who are incarcerated, people in custody, it's important to make it available because of the high risk of dying or reincarceration. When we look at communities that have historically been marginalized, it's important to make sure that they're receiving a treatment. We look at rural America, it's important to make sure that treatment is there, because I, as a physician in rural America, have seen where people often don't go to treatment because it's 80 miles away. So these are the things that we're doing with telehealth, with expansion of treatment aspects, and making sure we're reaching people through harm reduction and other programs, so we can help them, meet them where they are, and help them move forward in getting the help they need.
Thank you. Barriers to treatment disproportionately affect people of color, pregnant people, individuals with children, those in rural communities, as Dr. Gupta pointed out, tribal communities, and states that have not expanded Medicaid. This is largely because these people may not have access to health insurance and may live in areas without access to substance use disorder treatment. Dr. Gupta, really quickly, how would reauthorizing ONDCP make treatment more accessible for people who already are marginalized within our healthcare system?
Thank you, Congresswoman. It's really important that the reauthorization of ONDCP will allow us to continue and actually be able to double down on our efforts of the progress that we're making. There's a lot more work to be done in order to save the 165,000 lives that the President is committed to doing by 2025, and the reauthorization will be a critical part of that.
Thank you, Dr. Gupta, for your testimony today and your important work tackling this crisis. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Subcommittee Chair McLean from Michigan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Gupta, for being here today. We all know the stats, but I think they're worth repeating. Right, in 2019, over 70,000 people died from an opioid overdose. In 2021, 106,000 Americans died from drug-related overdoses. These numbers are shocking, and right now in 23, we also know that fentanyl is the leading cause of death for individuals between 18 and 45, right? Again, these numbers are shocking and clearly deserve our attention. This is why I agreed to chair the bipartisan mental health and substance abuse task force. I mean, to your point, it crosses all sections in all lines. But I think we have to take a look at the, if I had a funnel at the small end of the funnel, can we stop it before it even gets here? Can we choke it off? To me, Dr. Gupta, it's apparent that China supplies precursor chemicals to the cartels that produce fentanyl in other drugs. Is that correct?
Predominantly China.
Thank you. Right, I'm sure there are other actors, but thank you. In April, I actually held a subcommittee hearing where our committee learned that Chinese money laundering organizations now dominate the money laundering networks for the Mexican cartels. I want to focus my questioning around that because, again, if we can cut off the money supply and we can stop the drugs from getting in on something that we may agree on, I think we might be onto something. Can you explain what your office has done to address this money laundering operation?
Thank you, Congresswoman. The Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020 has been very critical in addition to the Bank Secrecy Act to make sure that we're fleshing out the bad actors in the system. The Chinese underground banking system, as well as money laundering of illicit actors that are free riders along the expansion of the PRC, is a critical aspect that we need to be looking at very carefully. Now, we've also done more sanctions, double the sanctions this year than last year, and last year was double of the previous year of both the cartels but also chemical companies in China that are shipping these precursor chemicals as well, and individuals that are involved in it.
And I appreciate that, but I want to focus, and I know I'm getting really narrowly focused, but we had a whole hearing on this. And if you follow the money, a lot of times we can cut it off. What specifically, and maybe we're not there yet, but what specific actions have you taken to stop and choke off the money laundering scheme? Can you talk to that?
I can talk, obviously, about some of these, including some of the dark web operations and cryptocurrency. There's 2,000 or so cryptocurrencies out there to be able to do, but I will also invite you to a classified briefing on Monday and your staff to do that.
All right, thank you. I think you would agree that China is complicit in America's drug overdose and epidemic problem here.
I think the refusal of cooperation on counter-narcotics of the PRC is indicative of how much they value the lives of the 109,000 people, Americans, that we're losing every single year.
Again, follow the money, and if we can choke the money supply off, we know that the anti-money, the money laundering, from the Chinese government is happening. I would just encourage you to spend more time, effort, energy, and most of all, resources, because if we cut it off here, we can save deaths, we can save a lot of lives as it gets down the funnel. In 2022, there were almost 600,000 gotaways that crossed our border illegally, and they've already been 530,000 gotaways in 2023. As a reminder, gotaways is a term used for illegal immigrants who have been spotted crossing the border by agents on camera, but were not caught or processed by the officials. Is it possible that some of these gotaways are smuggling fentanyl into the United States?
Congressman, when we talk about what's killing Americans in large numbers, like 100...
Can we talk about my question, though? And my question is it possible that some of these over 530,000 gotaways are smuggling fentanyl? Is it possible?
Congressman, look, tunnels are possible and happening.
Okay.
This could be, drones are possible and happening. So
it is possible. The answer is yes. I appreciate you, and I'm out of time. Thank you so much. I look forward to our classified briefing.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes Representative Crockett from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for the work that you do. I just want to talk about my state really quickly, since we're talking about the border and how my colleagues have been down there once or twice, and so they feel like they know everything that happens at my border because they go on a little field trip. But I live in this state. I have also legislated specifically in this state, the state of Texas. And recently, my governor, who seemingly does nothing but atrocious things, decided that he was going to order that migrants and this doesn't say it, but specifically the headlines that we saw were children as well as pregnant mothers be pushed back into the Rio Grande. Currently, the DOJ is suing my governor because he decided that he wanted to use razor wire. This is not fixing fentanyl, as far as I'm concerned. Because you're the expert, do you believe that razor wire or ordering that women and pregnant mothers and children be pushed into the water, do you believe that that's fixing our fentanyl crisis?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. I would say majority of the fentanyl is coming through the ports of entry, and our focus should be where the problem is predominantly.
Thank you so much. Go ahead. And when you talk about ports of entry, I want to be clear, because sometimes in this chamber it seems like we only have one border and only one way to get into the United States, and somehow it's through Mexico. I just want to be clear. There's a northern border. There's also plains. Are you of the impression that drugs only come from Mexico?
Thank you, Congressman. Oftentimes, machinery parts like pill presser parts, dye-mold parts, they will come through other countries to the United States and smuggled southwards to be built into pill pressers. So there's the business traffic goes in all directions and across all ways in order to produce the final product.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, because I think we need to go back to step one in this process. You don't know it, but I practiced criminal law for almost 17 years in multiple states and on the federal level. I was on the defense side, so I dealt with people that were arrested for drug crimes. One of the things that I want to talk about is the difference in fentanyl and, say, cocaine. Cocaine is typically not prescribed by somebody's doctor, but it's my understanding that most people that are struggling with fentanyl are people that have become sometimes addicted to opioids because they were prescribed opioids. And it may have been for a car wreck. I also did those as well. Have a back issue, and ultimately the doctor takes you off, but because of the addictive nature, you're going out and you're trying to get it wherever you can. And so it sounds like we have a demand problem, number one. Would you agree with me that if we could reduce demand, then maybe people wouldn't be looking to supply where there was no demand?
I think it's both sides, and I think, as you very accurately said, that a lot of people, I have prescribed people and who've gone on the streets and then ended up in heroin and fentanyl as well, so I have a really direct experience with some of that work as well.
Absolutely. And so also, one of the things that is so frustrating to me is that we don't treat this as something that is multifaceted. You talked about it's not just the southern border, it's all things connected. It's not just saying, that the cartels are the problem, which I think we can all agree. That is one thing that we can all agree upon. The cartels are a problem for a lot of different reasons, and it's not just fentanyl. But one of the things that you talked about was locals. I believe that the National Drug Control Strategy notes that local problems need local solutions. Is that correct?
Yes, Congressman.
And ONDCP is responsible for administering a grant program specifically focused on local solutions, the Drug-Free Communities Support Program. Correct?
Correct.
All right. And I'm going to agree with you. As somebody who has had to deal with multiple clients that have been addicted, and as someone who is a black woman in this country, the '94 crime bill was a failure. And seemingly the only solutions that we ever have is more and more incarceration. I appreciate what you do because you are taking a multifaceted look. You're looking at the criminal aspect. You're looking at not just cash, but you're looking at crypto. You're also looking at more than one country, more than just Mexico. You're looking to try to solve the solutions while also making sure that those that are addicted get treatment instead of put into jail cells. And so I appreciate the work that you do. I hope that my colleagues understand that it's not so simple as let's just blame the border and we'll fix all the problems. And the last thing that I'll say is, in a very bipartisan way, I have introduced the STRIP Act, and that is to make sure that these fentanyl testing strips can get to the people that need them, so that even if they're struggling with addiction, they have the ability to test and to determine whether or not this odorless, this tasteless thing is actually laced within the product that they receive. Would you agree with me, things that such as testing strips are invaluable to helping us fight this war?
Yes, Congressman, we will happy to work with you on that as well.
Thank you. With that, I'll you back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Edwards from North Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Doctor, you testified a while ago that the precursor chemicals to create fentanyl were being sent to Mexico from China. Is that what I understood you to say?
Yes, Congressman.
So who in China is supplying these chemicals to the cartels in Mexico? Is it the Chinese government? Is it Chinese corporation? Is it Chinese cartels? Who in China is providing these drugs?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. There are Chinese chemical companies that often work with brokers, both on the China side and the cartel side, and accountants that ship those things. So it oftentimes is these chemical companies that are doing it. They could be in illicit business doing illicit work, or they could just be in illicit business, period.
So I'm not sure I understood your answer. Is it legal for these chemical companies to provide these chemicals to Mexican drug cartels?
That's a great question, Congressman. Here's the thing. If someone just asks you for a ton of certain chemical that's precursor for dual use, and that company doesn't check out who that is, and it's going through a broker, which is a questionable background, then obviously it's not for any good purpose, as opposed to the legal pieces of it. Are they just ignoring that? Absolutely. Many times that they are ignoring. Even legitimate companies are ignoring that.
What is this administration doing to prevent those companies from selling drugs that you say are illicit?
Broadly, 2 or 3 things. I'll be quick about it. First, we have more sanctions that are being placed on these companies every single day. We've got about 100 sanctions so far overall between Chinese and traffickers, Mexican traffickers. We put a global coalition together that is talking about precursors for the entire globe, not just, and we're watching China to put pressure. We've asked China that here's the 3 things you can do. Very specific ask. Know your customer for these companies. Make sure you have shipping labels that follow global norms. And then,
So, Doctor, in the interest of time, I'm gonna jump forward just a little bit. So, the administration, you're saying hundreds of sanctions are being put in place. It seems to me like you only need 1 sanction. So what is this administration doing in China to prevent these drugs from going to Mexico?
we are working constantly. Our ambassador, Nick Burns, in Beijing, I'm in contact with him regularly to speak with the Chinese about this. We're working with the government of Mexico to make sure that they are talking to China as well. We're putting international pressure on
So when do we stop talking? When does something become actionable that where the United States, where this administration can put its foot down inside of China and say, we've had enough. You are killing Americans through Mexican cartels. When do we hold China accountable?
Congressman, we will, first of all, we will work with you if you have any ideas. We are working here. I'd be happy to both share that with you. Some of those will be in the briefing, classified briefing that we're giving on Monday.
All right. I feel like you dodged the question. And it seems to me that we also have to cut off the source at several different places. We've talked about reducing demand. We all agree. It would be great if folks didn't feel better as they take these drugs. We've talked about the border, which, quite frankly, we've got evidence from many folks that is not being secure. I believe we also need to cut off the supply of these chemicals from China. I believe this administration, I believe you, have to have the courage to go to China and say enough is enough. This is a multidimensional problem, and that's one that I see is not being adequately addressed. In my last few seconds, I'd just like to say that I heard you imply to another member in questioning earlier that the fact that we're capturing more fentanyl than ever before is somehow a success story. I'm not sure that I can agree with that. I'm looking at the deaths, the fentanyl deaths over the last 5 years, ending January 2019, 68,000, and then you told us a while ago that ending January 2023, we had 109,000 deaths. I don't know how we can say that is a success, particularly if you're a family member of someone who died with a fentanyl overdose. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Moskowitz from Florida for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you for holding this an important topic. I replaced Congressman Ted Deutsch in Congress in the last election, and he lost his nephew to fentanyl. And I remember when that happened, to an accidental fentanyl overdose. And I'm happy that the state of Florida has just recently passed the use of fentanyl test strips, because that will obviously help us in this battle. And I'd say to my friends across the aisle, very few that are here, but I would say to them that, listen, this is a bipartisan effort on going after fentanyl. We don't need to be convinced. We don't need to be educated. We know what's happening. We've seen the numbers. We know this is affecting kids across the country. But we've heard a lot about the cartel, Doctor, and the drug trafficking trade that's going on in Mexico. And so I want to ask you a question, Doctor. These cartels, these drug traffickers, in addition to the drugs that they're carrying, do you know what else they like to carry? It's not a trick question. Just yell it out when you know it. Guns. They like to carry guns, Dr. Gupta, right? That's what protects the cartel. That's what protects the drug trade. Do you know where they get their guns? Do you know where the cartel, the guys that they're talking about, get their guns? You know where they get their guns?
From illicit, illegal purchases.
That's right. And do you know where those illicit, illegal purchases are happening and where they're coming from?
Largely from the United States.
That's right. According to U.S. Custom and Border Control, 200,000 guns pour over the border every year from the U.S. to Mexico. These weapons are being used to contribute to organized crime. They're being used by the drug trade, the cartel, and 70% of all of the weapons the cartel is using are manufactured in the United States. The drug sales and the cartel and China, what they're doing is intentional. I agree with my colleagues across the aisle. I think what the cartel and China is doing is intentional. But so is what the gun manufacturers are doing. It's intentional. And so all of these guns manufactured here, pouring over the border, we, the United States, are arming the cartel. We, the United States, are allowing the cartel to protect the illicit drug trade by allowing guns manufactured here to pour over the border. My colleagues across the aisle are very concerned about things coming in, but they have no concern about weapons going out. And so Mexico has even filed lawsuits against the gun manufacturers. In fact, just 3 days ago, Mexico has asked a U.S. appeals court to reinstate the $10 billion lawsuit that they have against the gun manufacturers. And the lawsuit specifically states, and Mexico contends it's 500,000 guns pouring over the border every year. But in that lawsuit, Mexico says that the lawsuit against the cartels is specifically, the lawsuit that is against the drug manufacturers is specifically for facilitating the trafficking of weapons to the drug cartels, right? So right now, we have a foreign country suing the drug manufacturers, the gun manufacturers, saying that we are arming the cartel, our U.S. companies. And so what's even better than that is the gun manufacturers in this lawsuit are saying they have immunity. They have immunity in this lawsuit because my colleagues across the aisle have provided them immunity, that they can't be sued. Now, we're fighting over whether that applies to a foreign government. That's what the lawsuit really is about. But we're with you on a bipartisan basis to try to stop fentanyl from coming in. But can you be with us on a bipartisan basis that maybe the gun manufacturers shouldn't have immunity to sell guns, to make sure to have guns get in the hands of the cartel? I understand you're not with us on wanting to prevent that in this country, but maybe together we can do it to make sure that our guns are at least not going to the drug cartels, facilitating fentanyl from coming in. I mean, when are you guys going to wake up and realize that guns are a part of this equation? I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Mr. Biggs from Arizona for 5 minutes.
I was intrigued to hear the gentleman say he didn't need to be educated, but let me educate you. For the last 7 years, I have advocated for southern-bound vehicles and individuals to be searched for guns and money. I've advocated for that strongly. I want you to be educated. Go read a book called Operation Wide Receiver. That's an ATF operation. Go read up about Operation Fast and Furious. And then go look at cross-border trafficking heading south and the few operations that we run. I've advocated for more resources to go there. We have lost our dogs that can sniff for guns and money. We have found millions of dollars and guns going across. Gun laws exist to prevent that southern crossing, but we're not enforcing it. That is the biggest problem in my mind. Now,
will the gentleman
yield? No, I won't yield. Our colleagues across the aisle regularly cite the vast majority of drug seizures are at the port of entry. I love that. I love that. You know why that is? It's not because that's where all the drugs are coming through. It's because, guess what? We inspect every person and vehicle coming through a port of entry. That's what you have down there. Isn't that true, Dr. Gupta?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, Congressman?
No, I can't. We have density readers. We have technology that allows us to screen the structures of vehicles being used to transport humans and drugs. Isn't that correct, Dr. Gupta, at the ports of entry?
We do have technology at the ports of entry.
In fact, they're examining a high proportion of trucks we need to be inspecting more, whether it's in Nogales, San Isidro, all the way down to RGV. But we inspect a significant number of them, as well as individuals. If there's an anomaly in a vehicle, our density readers pick it up. We then take that vehicle, and guess what we find? Drugs. That's why we find more drugs in the ports of entry. Is that not true, Dr. Gupta?
Better screening does lead to better detection.
Right, and when you have between the ports of entry, I saw you went down to the Tohono O'odham Reservation. You went to the San Miguel Gate. I'd ask you, did you go 3 miles east of the San Miguel Gate?
I did.
And there's nothing there, is there? There's a 4-string barbed wire from San Miguel Gate that runs literally for 20 miles till you get to the port of entry at Sasabe. Did you see that?
Yeah, but I didn't see the 2,000 trucks a day that goes through there either, that I did at Nogales.
Yeah, that's right. But you know what you can see if you go there? You will see, if you wait, you'll see lots of people coming through. And you went down, I asked you last time you were here to go down with me without the officials, because the officials are going to give you that sanitized version. I asked you to come down with me, and just you and I, we would drive along there. I could show you that. We could go to Lukeville. We could go anywhere around Lukeville. We could go down to Yuma, and from Yuma and move west, and you would see massive amounts of trafficking coming across from drugs and individuals. So you missed out a little bit on that. And
I didn't, with no disrespect, but I went down there with shadow wolves in the Tohono O'odham Nation.
Yeah, I know. I've been down there with the shadow wolves myself.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's a great trip.
Yes. But we get back to my point. You were watched. They took you with you. They had a message and a narrative for you to see. You need to go down without the narrative created for you. And the problem that you have here is when I'm told that you guys don't need to be educated on the other side, and that somehow we don't care what goes south, heavens, go back and watch the many times I've said we need to go see what's going south. But moreover, pull your heads out of the sand. What's going on between the ports of entry? I find it intriguing that people from the Northeast say, oh my gosh, you guys are making this up. There are videos of 3 days ago watching the traffic just outside of Lukeville, Arizona, the Oregon Pipe National Monument. What's going on? What's going on is people are moving from ports of entry. You know what the Tucson sector did last week? Over 9,000 apprehensions. Over 9,000 apprehensions. Many pounds of fentanyl coming in. That's between the ports of entry. Face the facts. Between the ports of entry is where the drug smugglers and human traffickers come. Why is that? Because all of our resources are depleted. You've got OFO working the ports of entry, but between the ports of entry, when I was last down there driving east from San Miguel Gate, do you know how many Border Patrol agents we saw? None. And when we saw a group come across, we had to get on top of the vehicle, make a call. They couldn't come. They couldn't spare anybody until they said, well, we got a congressman with us. Oh, okay. Next thing you know, 45 minutes later, here comes the 6 vehicles from Border Patrol. That's what's going on. Please wake up. The drugs are pouring through the ports of entry for sure, but between the ports of entry, that is where it's flowing, and we can't catch them because we don't have anybody there. Yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Mafume from Maryland for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I want to thank you and Ranking Member Raskin for calling us together for this hearing, and I want to thank Mr. Gupta for his appearance. Mr. Gupta, I've got a lot of respect for your work over the years. I've followed that work. It's quite creditable, and I can't speak for other members, but it's my plan and intention to vote for and to fully fund ONDCP. Dr. Gupta, you mentioned in your opening statement that the drug trafficking is a crime that must be prosecuted and that drug addiction is a disease that must be treated. It's an interesting intersection there, and I couldn't agree more and believe that this is a cornerstone of the Biden-Harris administration's approach to drug policy because it is evidence-based, it is common sense, and it is long, long overdue. I want to talk about both of those things. I've just been making so many notes. There's been so much said here today. And as one great philosopher once said, everything that can be said has been said. It's just that not everyone has said it. So bear with me while I be deliberately redundant. Since its start, the Biden-Harris administration has shown a robust commitment to advancing equally the sort of things that we need, centering on recovery over punishment in our federal response to the overdose crisis. And the administration understands, as I said before, that addiction is a disease. And we actually want to see results, and we must treat it like that rather than to simply over-criminalize it and the people who unfortunately find themselves using it. There's a part of me that believes that art imitates life and sometimes vice versa, and I could not help but to think of the movie The Godfather and a point in time when we didn't have addictions in this country, that the greatest crime was to go make some moonshine, put a cap on it, and sell it as alcohol. And so we had prohibition for a long, long time. Prohibition was ended, and there's the scene in the movie where the 5 dons get together to decide how are they going to make money off of addiction, since they could not deal with selling moonshine anymore. And they're sitting around a table, and Don Corleone asks the 5 of them, what should we do? And they said, oh, we've got this great, great, great drug. It's addictive. It's called heroin. And we can spread that out. It will triple our sales. And Corleone thinks about it for a minute, and he says, no, 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 that's bad. That's bad. We will not do that in our communities. Give it to the blacks. And in those days, the blacks meant the blacks and the browns. And so Latinos and African Americans in the greater New York area became the new marketplace. And the addiction in those communities, because the drug was given away free of charge at first to make sure there was addiction, that just grew and grew and grew. And so we fast forward from there and we look at what happened in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Heroin was king. In the 70s and 80s, crack was king. In the 90s, we all talked about and were afraid of meth. At the turn of the century, opioids became the big thing because it broke out from those communities, and it was everywhere in everyone's community. And all of a sudden, it got great, great attention. And now we have been dealing with fentanyl, which has taken 109,000 lives in just the last year. It's the drug of death, the one that we're all afraid of. But I suspect that it's going to take strong will to deal with this and a realization that it's not just guns or something else, it's cartels who ought to be gone after on an international level and gone after in the most severe way. It's not just the little kid on the corner that's selling something that he got from somebody that he got from somebody. We could lock him up 1,000 times, but what we used to call the old French connection, the people who control the drugs, the international cartels, continue to do what they want to do, and they do it by buying off people left and right, and in some instances, buying off elected officials in one country after another. So I would just strongly urge that you continue to do what you do, to remember that this is an addiction. 30 years ago in this committee room, Kurt Schmoke, the mayor of Baltimore, came and testified that we ought to treat it as an addiction, he and a group of progressives, and were laughed out of this room by people who said, no, we need a war on drugs. And his point was, no, we need to take the profit out of it so that there is no war. So I don't know if I've exhausted my time, Mr. Chairman. Again, I have no question because I have no time left, but thanks for the opportunity to share some of the things that are here. And Dr. Gupta, thank you very much for your work.
Chair now recognizes Representative Fry from South Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing. Dr. Gupta way over here on the bottom bench here, but thank you for being here today. Prior to my service in Congress, starting just this year, I was in the General Assembly of South Carolina, where I was the chairman of the South Carolina Opioid response team, so to speak. We did, it was a select committee that was tasked with listening to medical doctors, law enforcement, teachers, people in long-term recovery, grieving families, and all types of professionals on how we can get a hold of this. And, you know, we borrowed a lot of our strategies from what other states were doing. We did some of our own that other states borrowed. That's kind of the beauty of the labyrinth of democracy, if you will, in our federal system. And I think that there were some pretty healthy policy initiatives that were passed into law, that were signed into law. But unfortunately, we've seen those numbers continue to climb with fentanyl coming into our country through ports of entry, through between the ports of entry, through really everywhere. I mean, for a while there, you could almost FedEx it in. So, you know, this is certainly important to me because I've talked with a lot of families. I think everybody here has. I've talked with families just last week. We had a county councilwoman whose son died of a fentanyl overdose. And so you think about the stories and the human capital and casualty associated with them, and you really want to fix it, not only from the prevention side, which is where it's probably most effective, but from the substance abuse and treatment side too, and try to get these folks back. So, you know, during President Trump's tenure in 2018, they passed the Support Act related to ONDCP. In your mind, what improvements were made because of that 2018 law coming or being signed into law?
Thank you, Congressman. I testified during that time for this passage as a commissioner of West Virginia Health. I think a lot of work has been done to hold our agency more accountable and transparent in terms of data, dashboards, and really having the plans to be able to get done the work of the American people. And coordinating the 19 drug budget control agencies with a drug budget control budget. So the value of this agency in the mind of Congress, but also in the mind of American people, is actually being able to put bring all the agencies together to fight this scourge, the challenge that has both addiction on one hand as a disease and the trafficking on the other hand as a profit. So this Support Act has been critical and central, pivotal to making the improvements. Numbers don't always reflect it, but we've gone through a pandemic at the same time. So we're in tough times right now in so many ways, but we are making consistent progress every single day in terms of those people. And I've treated so many people, hundreds, if not thousands of people with addiction myself, and seen some of them die in my hands.
Right, and thank you, for sharing that. And I think this was a big step forward. What in your mind, related to the Support Act moving forward, deserves an examination or improvement, since we're going to be examining this coming up shortly?
Well, certainly we think that there's a lot of things in terms of emerging threats like xylazine that we could improve on, how to get us there. This first time we did that, declared it to save more lives. We could do better on that. The coordination, there's some aspect of having better use of taxpayer money and what positions are needed prescriptively or not in order to get the job done. And then there's obviously data and dashboard. I think we've had some questions today that the data could be very helpful if we were to keep that data with us to be able to answer those questions.
Doctor, I think there was a Carnegie Mellon, and I'm going on memory, but there was a Carnegie Mellon study several years ago that said for every $1 that you invest in prevention, you save either, and I'm going to probably inverse these, but either $4 in medical costs and $7 in criminal justice. It's one of the two, but for every $1 that you invest in prevention, that you save that on the back end. The Support Act in 2018 allowed for some HIDTA funds to be used or allocated for prevention and treatment of drug abuse. What percentage was allowed?
I want to say it was 10%. Well, we can get you the numbers exactly, but for HIDTA, it's the best return on investment, $83 for every dollar invested. And the prevention of HIDTA, as well as other departments, education, health, and others, it is so critical at this time right now to invest more in prevention, especially for our youth.
Doctor, and what types of prevention and treatment programs does that fund? Just curious.
It funds partnership with our other program called Drug-Free Communities Program, which is focused on youth prevention across all communities, 50 states, 750 programs almost, and it helps prevent youth both initiation of drug use, but also delaying in drug use sometimes as well.
Thank you, Doctor. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Representative Ocasio-Cortez from New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Dr. Gupta, for testifying before the committee today. And thank you for your tireless commitment to ending the overdose crisis, which has devastated so many families across the United States. ONDCP holds a unique position within the federal government, coordinating across 19 federal agencies and overseeing $41 billion as part of a whole-of-government approach to address addiction and the overdose epidemic. In addition to that, ONDCP's unique structure also enables it to be both nimble and comprehensive in its response to the addiction crisis. Dr. Gupta, how does the ONDCP utilize its unique cross-agency structure to effectively combat the addiction crisis?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. We utilize the ability to have both drug control budget, fund control notice, as well as the ability to work through policy, implementing and making sure that the drug control strategy is implemented across all 19 drug control agencies. And really the coordination is so critical in this area when 109,000 Americans are dying a year.
Mm-hmm. And for emphasis, since releasing the 2022 National Drug Control Strategy, what are some of the successes of the ONDCP's whole-of-government approach?
So on the treatment side, we've seen more naloxone or Narcan get out there, 37% increase in prescribing, while 12% reduction in price. It will go over the counter in the upcoming days to weeks to months. We've seen expansion of treatment, making sure that telehealth provision happens, making sure that more removal of exfil with the support of Congress we've been able to do is to expand treatment providers from 129,000 to almost 2 million now. We've seen that more resources $86 billion in this, $83 billion in this administration, 42% over the previous administration go into local communities. At the same time, we've seen having more Caesars at the border, but understanding the problem doesn't begin or end at the border, working across the entire global supply chain as well.
Fabulous. And are there any changes the committee should consider making through the ONDCP reauthorization process to improve the office's ability to coordinate drug control policy and action across the federal government?
Thank you for that question, Councilwoman. I think it's important that as we move forward, that we allow more ability for getting better data, as well as being more proactive in emerging threat. The fact is today, not even 5 to 7 years ago, the threat we face with synthetic compounds, not just in the United States, but across the globe, we're going to have to be more nimble, but more proactive. And those aspects will allow us to do that, to remove less of the bureaucracy, more of the actionable parts that have more return on the taxpayer dollars.
Okay. And just to put a finer point on what you just shared, when you talk about getting better data, what does that look like? What are the levels of data that you all seek in order for us to make sure that we properly address that?
Well, thank you, Congressman, for that question. The fact is that over 20 years today, with this crisis, 100,000 people dying, we still don't have real-time data of overdose and non-fatal overdoses. We know for every fatal overdose, there are 14 potential non-fatal overdoses. We do this with heart attacks, we do this with strokes, we do this with so many of the diseases. It's important to have that data so we can get people the help that they need sooner than wait for them to die.
And so it's my understanding that currently you all do not have, and consequently we, do not have real-time data on overdoses happening in the United States, including non-fatal overdoses. Wow. Okay. With that, I yield back to the chair. Thank you very much.
Would my friend yield?
Absolutely.
I thank my friend. Just clarify, Dr. Gupta, because you were asked about, well, why aren't we pressing China? And I don't think your answer fully responded. I want to give you the opportunity. Surely we are pressing China. Surely, for example, it's on every agenda when a senior U.S. official like the Secretary of State goes to visit China. Would you comment?
Thank you, Congressman. It is. This is one of the most important topics for our conversation with the People's Republic of China, with the government. Every time that our ambassador is talking to the Chinese, this comes up. Secretary of State's visit. This is a high priority item for the president and for this administration to hold China accountable for the precursor shipments. But we're also at the same time not waiting on China to act. We're taking actions proactively, not only sanction them, create a global coalition, and work with our partners like Mexico and others to make sure that we're holding them accountable. Thank you.
Time's expired. Chair now recognizes Mr. LaTurner from Kansas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Gupta, for being here today. The ONDCP has been on the front lines of our nation's battle against drug addiction and has had a far-reaching impact on public health and safety in our communities. I'd like to commend you, Dr. Gupta, as well as all the dedicated men and women at your agency for their hard work. Today, I want to talk about fentanyl. Over the past few years, Kansas has seen a staggering 73% spike in fentanyl overdoses, one of the highest increases in America. It's hard to find a community in my district that hasn't been impacted by this epidemic. 2 milligrams of fentanyl, a lethal dose for most people, is cheaper than a can of pop and is killing more young Americans than car crashes, suicides, and COVID-19 combined. Major drug trafficking routes along I-35 and I-70 corridors make my home state of Kansas ground zero for the fentanyl crisis. Over 1,200 Kansans have already died from fentanyl poisoning, and when I talk to local law enforcement, it's clear that this crisis is only getting worse by the day. In addition to securing the southern border, I believe proper education and awareness in our schools, homes, and communities can be the difference between life and death. We need to educate parents and teens on the reality we are facing, that a lethal dose of fentanyl in a Percocet pill or another illegal street drug is often just one wrong Snapchat message away. I have seen this tragic sequence of events play out far too many times in my district. The ONDCP must do its part and take serious action to help ensure communities across Kansas are educated on the dangers of one of the deadliest drugs our nation has ever seen. Dr. Gupta, the DEA has recently reported, and I quote, a sharp increase in the trafficking of fentanyl mixed with xylazine. Can you explain what xylazine does when mixed with fentanyl?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. Xylazine, or mixed with fentanyl, or it's known as trank dope on the streets, basically enhances the duration, the high of the use of fentanyl, so people have to use fentanyl less often. It is an animal tranquilizer that was never and has never been approved for human consumption. So it is a terrible drug. It causes flesh wounds and leads to amputations like I, as my 25 years of career as physician, have never seen. And it has its own addictive capacity and capability, which makes the response, both overdose as well as treatment, much worse.
Are there any notable domestic sources of xylazine? Where's it coming from?
It's predominantly coming from Chinese manufacturers being shipped directly into U.S. or into Mexico and trafficked. There's some that is being diverted in other places as well, but at this point, it is mostly being mixed in on the streets or coming mixed in from the cartels.
Can you please briefly elaborate upon the high-intensity drug trafficking areas, what it does and what your role is in administering it?
So one of the two grant programs that Congress intended for and our office runs is called the HIDA program, or High Intensity Drug Trafficking Program. They're located in all 50 states, especially where there are high drug trafficking areas, that work as a fusion center, more or less, for intel sharing and other programs that bring the local, state, federal law enforcement officials together and really process and work on cases. It is the best return on taxpayer dollars. For every dollar that's invested, $83 in return happens. And it was responsible for seizing domestically 26,000 pounds of fentanyl just last year.
You talk about the Fusion Center. I think Kansas has a model perhaps for the nation at doing that and doing it well. Thank you, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Ms. Brown from Ohio for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Gupta, for joining us today and for continuing the Biden-Harris administration's tireless efforts to eradicate the crisis of addiction and drug abuse, which stretches into every corner of this country, red and blue districts alike. I want to be clear, Dr. Gupta, you and I both know there is still work to be done to end this horrific epidemic. Just this week, Axios reported that Cuyahoga County, which I represent, experienced 343 deaths from opioid and cocaine overdoses last month alone. Those 343 deaths were tragic and preventable. We also know that many overdose deaths involved illegal synthetic fentanyl. That's why the Biden-Harris administration's proactive, preventive, and powerful action has been so welcome. One of the Biden-Harris administration's strategies to prevent opioid overdoses is to make sure opioid overdose reversal medications are readily available over the counter and accessible to the public without stigma or shame. That includes the life-saving, easily administered nasal spray, naloxone, as well as Narcan. Dr. Gupta, easy for me to say, Dr. Gupta, what steps have the Biden-Harris administration taken to make sure that any person can access Narcan when they need it, or can keep it on hand if they live or work with people experiencing opioid addiction?
Thank you, Congresswoman. The amount of resources that are going to states right now to make sure that anyone who needs the naloxone or overdose reversal medication, also known as Narcan, is available. We're also making sure that it is available over the counter later this summer. There will be other products what will help us reduce the price in the market as well. We want to make sure that anyone can get this medication, but also proactively carry it, not just necessarily for themselves, but someone in their family or someone in their neighborhood, school, other places. So the access to naloxone or Narcan is critical to reducing these numbers down and getting people a chance to be connected to care.
Thank you for that. And those decisions by the Biden-Harris administration will continue to save lives. Additionally, President Biden's fiscal year 2024 budget proposes a historic investment of $46 billion to combat the overdose epidemic, which is largely driven by opioids like fentanyl. The President's budget also calls for increased funding to support overdose prevention, addiction treatment, and care for people recovering from addiction. Because we know that addiction is a disease that can happen to anyone. So, Dr. Gupta, how will increased investments help your Office of National Drug Control Policy and federal agencies do more to address the fentanyl and opioid crisis?
Thank you, Congresswoman. The reason that President proposing an unprecedented and historic investments at a time into drug policy when we have an American dying every 5 minutes around the clock is because people need help right now. Expanding treatment, expanding overdose reversal medication is critical to saving lives. And at the same time, we've got to put more technology at the border, make sure that we're working to disrupt the entire global supply chain. Both of these things go hand in glove, and that's exactly the plan that the President has proposed his budget behind.
Thank you again. The President's fiscal year 2024 budget request demonstrates the Biden-Harris administration's dedicated efforts to continue to combat the fentanyl crisis, which is exactly what we need to do to bring American families the relief they so desperately need. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Would my friend yield?
Oh, yes, happily yield to the gentleman from Virginia.
I thank my friend. Ms. Brown just mentioned Narcan and other drugs to try to help wean people off addiction. But one of the problems documented, say, in Beth Macy's book, Dope Sick, is that we don't really regulate rehab facilities. And a lot of them take the AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, cold turkey approach. Absolutely lethal if you're talking about opioids. You can't just go cold turkey. Would you comment on the need for regulation or what we're doing to try to educate these pop-up rehab facilities that are probably doing more harm than good, driving people to heroin?
Thank you, Congress, for that question. It's important, like we treat diabetes, think about our high blood pressure. Because addiction is a disease and we have FDA-approved medication, the evidence supports utilizing these medications to help people not only save lives, but be productive back into the community. So the goal here, in my view, and I've treated a lot of patients, is to help people enable themselves to become productive members of society, and medication and a proper treatment system infrastructure allows us to do just that.
I thank my friend for yielding. Thank you.
Chair recognizes Mr. Burleson from Missouri for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Gupta, for being here. According to the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, the Mexican cartels are the ones that are responsible for most of the fatal drug poisonings. In 2022, it was over 107,000 people. And as you know, the data, 67% of that was from fentanyl. My question is that some of this is some people are coming in contact with this. Some victims are coming in contact with fentanyl, not necessarily by taking a pill, but in everyday items like cash and food. Can you elaborate on the extent of that?
So the powder, if you think of powder, is not really, it poorly absorbs through the skin surface. Of course, if you're inhaling a large dose of fentanyl, like 2 milligrams is a large dose for an unsuspecting person, it is potentially fatal. So it's important for us to distinguish the ability of casual versus actual. But at the same time, I will say that if anyone that thinks that they've come across in touch with fentanyl, it's important to get them checked out. That's the important piece here.
But do you think of the cases of overdoses, is there a percentage of people that are inadvertently, these are not drug users, these are people that accidentally inhaled apparently fentanyl from a dollar bill they gained, or?
Thank you, Congressman. If we look at the number of people who die, of the 100,000, and 70% of roughly, or 80% of them are being fentanyl, what we find is that either they are still accidental oftentimes because they've taken a pill that they think is Xanax or Adderall or others. Those are the majority of people.
The majority, okay. Okay, so, and we now know that the Chinese have for a long time been supplying the precursors for fentanyl, but they're not supplying fentanyl itself. Is that correct?
They're not. It's come down to literally zero after 2019 May. That we had success with the Chinese to stop fentanyl production, but then started the precursor production.
So there is an ability for the United States to put pressure on China to curb some of this.
And we're doing exactly that, Congressman.
Okay, so with that, just can you elaborate what your office is doing to work with China on not just on the supply of the precursors for fentanyl?
Every meeting, literally, that have senior high officials that we have with U.S. officials with China, we're bringing this up to them to demonstrate why this is so important to us. We're also making sure that every one of those companies that we find to be illegitimately supplying precursors, we're working to sanction them. At the same time, we're also created a global coalition, launched it with 80 countries and 11 international organizations around, signaling that this is the synthetic drugs are a global threat. To bring China with or without China, we're going to continue. And then at United Nations, we have gotten more substances controlled than ever before with U.S. leadership to make sure that China understands that. And we still have other tools that we will, again, work with.
So speaking of other tools, in the subcommittee that we had in April, we learned that the Chinese money launderers have taken over the money laundering operations for the Mexican drug cartels. How has this been impacted, or how has China's strict capital flight laws motivated Chinese individuals to aid in laundering money for the cartels?
We definitely feel some of the laws, the overall policies, are supporting the creation of these these illegal and criminal networks that allow both underground Chinese banking, cash, as well as other financial institutions that are being created outside of the United States to launder money.
And so what role, if you will, what role do the money launderers play? I guess they're called brokers. These are Chinese brokers.
So President Biden executed an EO 14059, I believe it was, to go after beyond the Kingpin Act, the enablers of the drug trade. That includes brokers, accountants, real estate agents, lawyers of these traffickers. So what we are doing is we're going after all of those individuals.
Everyone in the chain.
Everyone in the chain, because it turns out sometimes it is these brokers, these accountants that are more important than just the lowest hanging fruit.
Are there any apps or software that they're utilizing that we could pull some of that data for that we're not able to get today?
FBI has a program called J-Code, the Joint Criminal Opioid Darknet Enforcement Program, and HSI has another program as well. We're working with those, but we have a briefing, classified briefing on Monday. We would love to have you to talk more about this as well.
I look forward to that. Thank you. My time has expired.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Connolly from Virginia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gupta, Dr. Gupta, I didn't hear you answer the question about are you or have you issued guidelines and/or regulations to those entities that are purporting to help opioid or fentanyl-addicted individuals try to recover? Because, as I understand it, it's a pretty unregulated market.
I think if we're talking about the treatment sites of this...
Are you issuing guidance to those people? Does the federal government say, hey, this is not AA, you can't go cold turkey, you got to allow Narcan or other drugs that step down, and by the way, you're going to have to allow that for a long period of time because this is a different kind of addiction?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. Our grants that go out, especially federal grants through Health and Human Services, do require some of these things that you're mentioning.
Require, if they take federal money?
Correct.
Okay. All right. I just want to clear up a couple of things that were said earlier or hinted at earlier in this hearing, and hopefully quick answers, but the source of fentanyl in the United States comes through illegal border crossings in Mexico. Is that correct?
The majority of the fentanyl is coming through the ports of entry.
So it's not on the backs of people trying to cross into the United States illegally.
I can speak to them. Over 90% or almost 90% are coming through the ports of entry.
The use of consumption of illegal substances like fentanyl is primarily an immigrant problem. It started there, and it really is characterized by that population in the United States apparently consuming drugs inordinately. Is that correct?
Congressman, of course, the fact is exemplified that 109,000 Americans are dying every year, that it pervades through all communities, all geographies, all socioeconomic status.
But it's not factually correct, or is it, that it's primarily immigrants in that population?
Not factually correct.
Not fact. For example, I represent one of the wealthiest communities in the United States. We have addiction problems, and we have addiction overdose in Fairfax County, Virginia. Is that not correct?
That is correct. I'm a resident of your community.
And those are not necessarily immigrant individuals or communities. There was also a suggestion, and if we could put up, your office claims these successes. One of our colleagues suggested, I'm not sure I want to reauthorize DCP, and what would be the consequences if we didn't have your office in this struggle to get our hands around tranq, fentanyl, opioids, and the like?
Congressman, I think it would send the wrong message to the American people about the seriousness that this Congress takes when it comes to the killing and the deaths of 109,000 Americans each year. Just within the last time we've been in this committee, we have over 25 Americans that have been killed.
I take it that it's the wrong signal, but put that aside. Some people don't care about that. Operationally, what would be the consequence if you didn't exist, if you went away and we didn't reauthorize you?
Thank you, Congressman. It would weaken significantly the response of federal, local, and state law enforcement, as well as first responders and public health officials to respond to this crisis.
Because what? Grants wouldn't flow, coordination wouldn't happen, intelligence wouldn't be shared?
Because coordination would not happen, obviously intelligence would not be shared. HIDA program that does so much of prosecutions and efforts will not happen. And as a result of this, more Americans will surely die.
And finally, are you experiencing people moving from fentanyl because of our successes in trying to get some control over that to tranq? And how concerned should we be about that shift, if indeed there is such a shift?
We should be quite concerned. There's several 100% increase in what we find tranq associated with fentanyl deaths right now. It is primarily happening because of the pursuit to make more money by the traffickers and producers, and that's where we have to go after. We've got to make sure that we're helping people who need the help, but at the same time we're denying the profits and the operating capital of these cartels as well as transnational criminal organizations.
My time is up. I thank the chair and thank him for holding this hearing. I think this has a lot of potential for all of us finding common ground because all of our communities are affected. And I thank Dr. Gupta.
I agree with the gentleman from Virginia. Without objection, the member from Puerto Rico, Jennifer Gonzalez, is waived on to the committee for the purpose of questioning witnesses at today's subcommittee hearing. Without objection, so ordered. Chair now recognizes Mr. Timmons from South Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Gupta, thank you for being here today. I was a prosecutor for 4 years in South Carolina, and one thing that my worst cases had in common was drug use. Most of the people that irreparably harmed themselves, someone else, killed someone, did so while under the influence of a wide variety of drugs, sometimes many drugs. And, I think historically this country has been dealing with drugs. We've tried to use the stick, and that might have been a little bit too harsh. We've tried to use the carrot. I don't think that's going very well either. So I would argue that we might need to have a more balanced approach to holding people accountable that are perpetuating drugs and profiting off of drug-addicted individuals, and also help people that do in fact need help. Drug addiction is real, and we have tools in our toolbox to help address that. Would you say that that's a fair assessment of the history? We used too much of a stick in the 70s and the 80s, and now we might be a little bit too nice?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I would say it this way. When we were doing what we were doing 50 years ago, we didn't know any better. I never questioned the intent of what we were doing. It was we didn't know any better. Today we know addiction is a disease and it has to be treated. We also know trafficking is a crime and it has to be prosecuted.
But you would agree that when somebody overdoses and goes to the hospital multiple times, that, the first time you give them some education, maybe some resources. The second time, maybe involuntary commitment and do inpatient and try to help them help themselves. We don't really do that. We have recidivism as it relates to drug abuse, and we're now, well, real quick, just tell me about these harm reduction efforts, and how do you justify some of those efforts relative to helping people? Because I don't think giving people needles helps them. I think giving them inpatient rehab and helping to get them clean and giving them resources helps them.
So thank you, Congressman. As you mentioned, this person is suffering from a disease at the time, not often able to know what is needed. Helping them with overdose reversal so they can stay alive, because we cannot treat dead people, and I say this as a doctor. Getting them the ability to check their drugs to see if they have fentanyl, they can make a decision not to use it after that, is important and smart. Making sure the spread of chronic diseases doesn't happen, infectious diseases, and here's why it works. When I ran and saw the quick response teams in West Virginia, they would go back to someone and knock on their door for next day after that, after they overdosed, and we've got 30% people or more into treatment eventually, but just talking to them. And this is the kind of policy we need to be thinking. How do we approach people, help them, get into treatment? And sometimes, as a law enforcement and a social worker, going together to knock on the door and say, hey, what do you need?
Sure, I appreciate that, but it seems that a lot of our cities across the country are not really holding people accountable. We're not enforcing the criminal code. I'll give you a great example. You walk down the street in Georgetown with a beer or a glass of wine, you're going to get an open container ticket. But if you want to go smoke marijuana at Wisconsin and M, knock it out. I mean, marijuana is federally illegal. And the fact that we have this nebulous enforcement mechanism where in South Carolina you go to jail if you or smoke it in the military, you get kicked out. I mean, we're failing. We're failing at creating a structure through which our society can thrive, and it's causing problems. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Congressman. I can limit it to just marijuana. This is exactly why the president last fall took these actions. To make sure that people in the federal system who are for simple possession of marijuana are pardoned, because it's about their life beyond that, challenging the governors to do the same, and then asking the Attorney General and the HHS Secretary to work through, to look at what the current evidence is around scheduling in an independent way.
It's a very complicated issue, and I would argue that the federal government has lost the ability to enforce the law because it has refused to enforce the law for so long. And the fact that we have not addressed it in some meaningful way creates a lot of problems. I'm a JAG officer, captain of the South Carolina Air National Guard, and we regularly remove people from the military for smoking marijuana. And you can't walk a block in D.C. without smelling somebody smoking it. So, I mean, we need to get our policies in line with carrots and sticks and need to have nuances to achieve our objective. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Goldman from North Carolina, or from New York, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Gupta, for being here. Quick first question. Is it the policy of the ONDCP and the Biden administration to assist the Mexican cartels to traffic fentanyl into the United States?
Absolutely not.
So you try to stop fentanyl from coming into the United States, right?
Correct.
And in fact, we have seen some statistics recently that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have touted that there has been more success by this administration in seizing fentanyl coming into the United States. Is that right?
Yes, Congressman.
Well, I guess I'm a little troubled by tweets such as this from hold it up, please, a colleague of mine from New York who criticizes President Biden because during his administration, more than 34,000 pounds of deadly fentanyl has been seized at the southern border. That means that it did not come into our communities, right?
Yes, Congressman, if the assertion is we should let all of this come in and kill Americans, I will disagree with that every single day and every single minute.
Right. We're trying to stop the fentanyl from coming in. And there is no question, and there is bipartisan agreement, as we've been talking about throughout this hearing, that fentanyl and the opioid epidemic is devastating communities all around this country. It does not differentiate between Republican districts and Democratic districts, and there's no question that far too many people are dying. But it just really surprises me when my colleagues on the other side of the aisle try to criticize this information for successfully seizing some of that fentanyl coming across the aisle, coming across the border, rather. And I go back to what my distinguished colleague from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, had said earlier, that he supports trying to curtail the exportation of American-manufactured weapons of war to the Mexican cartels. There's been a lot of talk on the other side of the aisle that the Mexican cartels fully control the fentanyl trade, and of course they only are able to do that because of their possession of weapons of war. So I do hope they will come around as well to support bipartisan legislation to eliminate immunity for American gun manufacturers who are knowingly exporting guns. I didn't hear him say that. I would like to turn my focus a little bit to the work that we are doing with foreign partners to address the issues of the fentanyl trafficking coming across the border. There's been some talk of China and India and some of the component parts of certainly of fentanyl and synthetic drugs being provided by them. Is the administration and your office finding that you're running into obstacles and roadblocks from the Chinese government or even the Indian government in assisting you in your efforts to stop the fentanyl trade?
Thank you, Congressman. When we look at foreign nations, we look at the willingness and the capacity to take action to prevent diversion of these chemicals, precursor chemicals. With India, we're finding more willingness and a lot of capacity. PRC has the capacity, but has demonstrated absolutely no willingness to cooperate.
So in many respects, they are tacitly facilitating this devastating drug trade. Is that accurate?
But certainly they're not engaged, and they don't seem to be interested in becoming a global leader on this issue.
And what, from your vantage point, has the United States done, has this administration done, and should do in the future to combat the control and power of the Mexican drug cartels?
I think it's important to have a strong and stable partner on the south of our border. Part of that involves working closely with their law enforcement and military counterparts, working with the president and his security cabinet. Those are the things that we're doing right now. As you know, I've noticed that this El Chapo's son has been captured. We have Quintero, another drug cartel leader, captured. We have the killer of Kiki Camarena 40 years ago, a DEA agent, captured. So we are getting more successes, but it's because of the partnership, the support that we're providing. But it is important to also hold the government of Mexico accountable for the actions of cartels and other producers within Mexico as well.
Well, I'm out of time. I appreciate you being here and your testimony, and thank the chairman for holding this hearing, and I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Boebert from Colorado for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Gupta, nationwide, over 100,000 people have lost their lives from drug overdoses. We've heard a lot about that today. 1,799 of those deaths were Coloradans. Now, your office works with 19 federal agencies and oversees $41 billion with a goal of addressing overdoses and addictions, correct?
Yes, Congressman.
Your office is also responsible for implementing the Biden-Harris National Drug Control Strategy that was released over a year ago, correct?
That is correct.
Dr. Gupta, a key component of the Biden-Harris plan is to go after those who smuggle drugs into our borders, correct?
That is correct.
Why has this administration rolled back immigration policies that have a proven track record to secure the southern border, such as Title 42 or Remain in Mexico?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. Of course, I would defer all the questions to Homeland Security on the immigration piece. I can tell you on the drugs piece, we have more seizures today than we have had at any time.
Do you believe that's because more is coming over than at any other time?
I think we have better technology. I think we have more committed men and women in uniform.
Fentanyl is currently the #1 cause of death for adults 18 to 45. This is still getting into our country and still killing Americans throughout our nation. So would you agree that more fentanyl is coming across and that's why the seizures have increased?
I think what I would say is this. It is important to seize every piece of fentanyl that comes across our border, but at the same time, it doesn't begin or end at the border. It is important for us to look at the supply chain globally, as well as the profits that the traffickers are making off of it, as well as producers.
Dr. Gupta, you've noted that a significant amount of fentanyl comes through the ports of entry at the southwest border, correct?
Yes, Congressman.
You are aware that the Biden administration's parole program through the CBP One app, correct?
I am not involved with that program.
Are you aware of the program?
Just publicly, whatever I hear on the news.
Do you know how many inadmissible aliens were encountered at the ports of entry at the southwest border in fiscal year 2020?
I would have to defer those to Homeland Security.
Well, I just happen to have that answer. In fiscal year 2020, OFO encountered a little over 57,000 inadmissible aliens at the ports of entry. Do you know how many were encountered in fiscal year 2022?
What do you know?
Up from 57,000 to over 172,000. Do you know how many have been encountered so far in fiscal year 2023?
I would still defer you to Homeland Security.
So in fiscal year 2020, we had 57,000 inadmissible aliens at the ports of entry. 2022, over 172,000. And in fiscal year 2023, it's over 276,000. Now, is it fair to say that the OFO officers are much busier under Biden CBP One app parole program?
Once again, Congresswoman, I would, make sure that I would just defer all those questions because I'm not engaged in the immigration policy of the United States.
Well, I would recommend that you possibly have a discussion with OFO, if you haven't already, on how that increased flow affects officers' ability to interdict fentanyl at the ports. Would you agree?
I will continue to have those conversations. I have visited the border several times, and it is really important that we ensure that 109,000 Americans are dying, that we do everything in our capacity.
I agree, and I think that starts with securing the border, since we're seeing this increase of inadmissible aliens at our ports of entry. We know that people are coming over illegally. We have hundreds of thousands of gotaways, and certainly the amount of fentanyl deaths that you just mentioned are extremely severe. And I would say that is because more fentanyl is coming through our wide open southern borders, and it's because of the policies that have been implemented since January 2021. Dr. Gupta, I urge you and the Biden administration to please crack down on fentanyl and secure our borders. Have this conversation to keep Americans safe so we can put an end to this. I appreciate your time here today. My time has expired, but thank you for testifying before our committee, sir.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Luna from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Gupta, referencing the prison system, has your organization done anything to set up a nationwide policy on rehabilitation measures for people? The reason I ask that is because I've personally had family in and out of the prison systems, and sometimes the only way that these people get clean is by going to jail. And when someone does not go through that transition, they end up back within, whether it's the criminal cycle or the jail system itself. So can you elaborate on that a little bit for me?
Thank you, Congresswoman. You rightly pointed out this is a very important population. At any given day, there's 2 million Americans incarcerated, and 60 to 80% of them are in prison or jails because of either drug use or
Addiction.
Drug-related crimes. We've committed to offering treatment to everyone in custody in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and we've also released guidelines for 1115 Medicaid waiver to states to do the same for their jails and prisons. 15 states have already applied, 2 have been approved, including state of Washington and California.
What does that treatment involve? Is it drug-related, or is it actually a STEP program that's something like you'd see out of Narcotics Anonymous?
So these waiver applications can state what they want to be. They can state if they want state prisons or jails or both. They can state what details they want, but 90 days before release, they will have that treatment ready to go, and then they will have a continuity of care into the community, which is a really important step, which gets lost.
So just to be clear, so there's a system that's offered within the jail system, a rehab that they can go through, and then is that considered part of their releasing for sentencing? If they continue the program, are they given more lenient sentence? How does that work?
So that might be a drug court program, which we also support. We also support diversion or deflection programs. That's the entire arc of the criminal justice system. But in this case, when they're planned to be released in 90 days, and for a lot of jails, the turnover time is a lot shorter than that. It's oftentimes 50, 70 days. So that will be that their Medicaid or whatever insurance will not be turned off. They will continue to have that treatment, and they can get that treatment while in custody.
As part of that treatment, is there any faith-based organizations that are allowed to go in to facilitate that?
I think at this point I can get the details for you, but it's going to be the states that are going to have to propose that to CMS.
Okay. The next question I had was to follow up on one of my colleagues from across the aisle over there. I heard you answer on China being uncooperative with basically stopping some of the initial, I guess, chemicals for fentanyl production. I didn't hear you touch on India and how they've been effective, if you can just reiterate that.
Thank you, Congresswoman. We are having, since 2020, a counter-narcotics working group with India being a large chemical industry as well as pharmaceutical. They have been very cooperative. We are working right now to have the 21st century drug policy framework developed with India to make sure that there's diversion protocols in place to hold, again, bad actors accountable. The same is not true for the PRC, the People's Republic of China. We were going to continue to press on them as much as we need to in order to get them to have them cooperate.
Okay, and then just to ask for my own clarification, you had mentioned that the Biden administration basically gave some form of forgiveness for those who were in possession of marijuana. Is that backdated, or when is that effective as of date-wise?
That was last fall, and for all those in federal custody.
At that point in time?
And that is backdated as well, I believe, but we can certainly get you details on that. But it is there's a mechanism that the Department of Justice has to go through to get those records removed.
Expunged would be the term, okay. And then my last question is, if you had a magic wand, what would you do to fix the crisis that you're currently seeing? Because I know that sometimes the legislation takes a while, so what's your opinion?
Congresswoman, that's an excellent question. 2 things I would say. One, attack the entire global supply chain with focus on money, follow the money. On the other hand, make sure that every American who needs to get treatment, their life saved, gets that opportunity to do so.
And you said that in the jail system, it's about 60% that are struggling with addiction.
Exactly, yes, yes.
Okay, all right, cool. Thank you, Chairman. I yield my time. Chairwoman.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions.
Madam Chairman, thank you very much. Doctor, welcome. This is an issue that will not go away, has not gone away. I remember meeting with one of your former colleagues, General Barry McCaffrey, on this same issue. My staff, a day or two ago, called what I believe is your staff and asked a simple question, and that was, do you ever say it's illegal in your advertising? Do you ever say that this is detrimental to your health? I don't know if you know what they told us, but I know what that answer was. Do you know what it was?
Congressman, if you're asking that we say about illegal drugs, that they're illegal, so yes, we do. But I don't know what form and where are you asking that we do say that.
To people who live in the United States, at least. The answer that we were given, that I was told, was, well, we don't control the message. That just is given out to someone else. They control the message on drug policy. We don't at ONDCP. And I was perhaps not surprised, but stunned that that would be the answer. That ONDCP outsources their message completely to someone else. I'm also stunned today that, in my opinion, and thank you for being here, that this administration is blaming other countries for our drug problems. I've heard you mention, in the little bit of time I've been here, China about 14 times. I've heard you blame other people. You remind me of a firefighter who's shown up when arson has already taken place. You show me the viewpoint that you want to shift the blame. Well, that's an old story. That's an old story that came back that we had in the 80s and 90s, when we effectively dealt with this issue. It does move somewhere else. It moved to the Keys, from the Florida Keys. It moved to high-speed cigarette boats. Different time, different era, but when there's effective law enforcement, you force criminal organizations, drug cartels, to do something different. Next line of questioning, please, Dr. Gupta. Have you ever seen the series that's called Drugs, Inc., that is on National Geographic?
I probably have.
Well, if you had, you would know, because it's in its at least 7th or 8th year. I encourage you, and if you can't get it, I will get you all the years. When they string them together, they tell the story, because they look at the drug cartels and the people who are pushing these products over the years, and then they show what the response is from the federal government. Is it a cat and mouse game? Yes, it is. Is it one where the drug cartels knew that they had to be very smart and do a number of things to evade getting arrested, going to jail, finding out where the method of operation was, and the United States catching on? That's how we caught on to submarines. That's how we caught on to tunnels. That's how we caught on to things, because we forced them, meaning drug cartels and criminals, to do different things. In my opinion, this administration and the Democratic Party is openly allowing this open border policy that is contributing to the hundreds of thousands of people that die over the years. You've referenced 100,000 a year for a long period of time. That is almost equal to or larger than the number of people we lost in World War II and any other war since. And yet this administration allows them full access to our United States border, full access for drug cartels to where they can put their marketing organizations. And I know you talked about HIDAs. The HIDAs are seeing this too. They're putting their marketing organization now, instead of in the big cities, they're in the next 2-tier cities down to where they have people in place who are called illegal aliens who've come to this country illegal, been given the free pass to move somewhere, and they just become part of the marketing organization. And the DEA knows that, and the head of ONDCP should. So my recommendation to you is that I think that you should go back and relook at and constitute yourself to where you're aware of these problems. And Drugs, Inc. over the last 7 to 10 years offers you, and it might be a good time over the month of August that you invest some time to look at this, and you'll see how the drug trade and how the fight by this government takes place. One last question.
The gentleman.
When was the last time that you met face-to-face with the President of the United States to give him the facts of the case that you have to us today?
Thank you, Congressman. I just tell you, first of all, please, that we do control our own message. I'd be happy to talk to you about that.
Well, hopefully your staff will
The
learn
gentleman
that,
may
and I'll
answer
be
the
glad
question,
to
but the
take that.
gentleman's
I'll be
time is
glad to
expired.
take that in writing.
And as far as the process of the drug trafficking cartel, we're very engaged in working with our 19 drug control agency, including DEA, to manage a whole of government response, and they do not have full access. The cartels do. I just spoke to the president this week, and he has my cell phone number. And we talked about this, how level of high importance he places on this issue, and he's fully committed to it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Puerto Rico, Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for Chairman Comer. I appreciate the opportunity to join the committee as you consider the reauthorization of the Office of National Drug Control Policy. And Director Gupta, it's good to see you. Your office is tasked with overseeing our nation's drug control efforts, including through the development and implementation of a national drug control strategy. Congress has required by law that this strategy also includes accompanying strategies to combat the flow of illicit drugs across the southwest and the northern border. Through appropriations report language, we have also required the inclusion of a strategy to combat the flow of illicit drugs coming through our maritime border in the Caribbean. Your office has released this Caribbean border counter-narcotics strategy with a particular focus on drug-related threats in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands in 2015, 2020, and last one in 2022. However, unlike the existing statutory requirement for the southwest border and the northern border counter-narcotics strategy, your office is not statutorily required to develop this third strategy despite the real threats we face from drug trafficking organizations in the Caribbean. And that's the reason I have introduced H.R. 920, the Caribbean Border Counter-Narcotics Strategy Act, which is a bipartisan and bicameral legislation to codify the requirement for ONDCP to include a Caribbean border counter-narcotics strategy in the National Drug Control Strategy. Just as Congress has previously codified the requirement to include the southwest border and the northern border counter-narcotics strategy. Drug trafficking in the Caribbean continues to represent a major threat to our nation. Nowhere is the risk clearer than in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, where we're home for 3.3 million Americans, and where the illicit activities of drug smugglers operating in the region contributes to violent crime in our communities and higher than ever average homicides rates. In fact, in a recent hearing, a CBP Air and Marine Operations official testified that Puerto Rico is the most violent maritime threat vector of any location they patrol, and that was here. This following the events of last November when drug smugglers shot and killed CBP Marine Interdiction Agent Mike Macera and injured 2 other agents during an interdiction off our coast. Let me provide you another example of the problem accordingly to publicly available data from CBP. CBP Office, Field of Operation, and Border Patrol seized over 241,000 pounds of cocaine nationwide during fiscal years 2020 and 2022. Approximately 52% of that cocaine seizures were carried out by the San Juan Field Office and the Ramey Border Patrol sector in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. This is almost 127,000 pounds of cocaine. And this should not be seen as a local or regional problem. According to law enforcement agencies, approximately 75 to 80% of the drugs coming into Puerto Rico from Colombia, Venezuela, are then smuggled onwards to the continental U.S., specifically the eastern coast of the United States. And that's why a strong border security presence and a counter-narcotics strategy focus on the Caribbean is critical for the entire nation. And that's the reason my bill will ensure we achieve this, in addition to codifying the requirement for the Caribbean border counter-narcotics strategy. This bill will also amend the definition of supply reduction in the ONDCP authorization to ensure the National Drug Control Strategy explicitly includes effort to disrupt the financial networks of drug trafficking organizations. And to effectively combat these criminals, it's essential that we hit them where it will hurt them the most, their wallets. So I want to thank Chairman Comer for having me today here. What's your comments on this bill, Dr. Gupta, or the efforts to support counter-drug operations in Puerto Rico?
Thank you, Congresswoman. We would love to work with you on the bill. It is critical, as you mentioned, Agent Maceda, the 3 agents of Customs Border Protection that boarded, which is unusual to have them be fired upon in the high seas in November of last year, was really important. We were so saddened to see his demise. We actually brought his colleagues to the White House recently to award him with the U.S. Interdiction Coordinator Award, National Award from the White House for that courageous work where he gave the ultimate sacrifice of his life. So thank you for bringing that up, and we would love to work with your office on that.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady from Puerto Rico yields back. Chair now recognizes Ms. Green from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today, Dr. Gupta. I want to talk to you about my district in Georgia. It's located in the northwestern part of our state, where fentanyl is a very serious issue. From 2019 to 2022, fentanyl-involved deaths increased in our state by over 230%. This is significant. It's alarming, but it's also deadly. People are dying almost daily. In counties throughout my district, in the 14th district, from 2019 through 2022, fentanyl-involved deaths increased by over 350%. That's in my district. The northwestern part of Georgia is nowhere near the border of our country. Fentanyl deaths in my district, here's some examples. There were 3 deaths in Walker County in February of this year, 37-year-old, 55-year-old, and 70-year-old, so it spans all ages. A 16-year-old girl in Whitfield County who had never taken any illegal substance in her life took a Xanax that she thought was going to help her with anxiety. Within 5 minutes, she was dead. In 2021, Catoosa County had 9 fentanyl overdose deaths. In January of this year alone, it is suspected that fentanyl is responsible for 8 overdose deaths. In November of 2020, Corporal Christopher Jackson, Walker County Sheriff Deputy, died after being exposed to fentanyl during an arrest. Fentanyl does not discriminate. It doesn't care about our skin color. It doesn't care about our age, doesn't care about our gender, doesn't care about our religion. It is a poison and it's killing people. And it's extremely concerning. With approximately 300 Americans dying from drug overdoses each year, Fentanyl is flowing into the country at record levels. As a matter of fact, the local law enforcement in my district blame the border policies of this administration for the fentanyl deaths and the increase to 350%. Your office is charged with coordinating the budgets of agencies that carry out national drug control policy. But while the drug crisis in this country soars out of control, the Biden administration is busy sending crack pipes, syringes, and safe sex kits to drug addicts in the name of harm reduction. There has not been any harm reduction, Dr. Gupta. People are dying every day. But are these so-called harm reduction strategies really the most effective way of dealing with the drug crisis in America? Wouldn't it be easier to deal with the drug addiction and drug overdose if there were fewer drugs in our country?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Clearly, if there were fewer drugs, that would help. But at the same time, we got to deal with the crisis we have at hand. I understand the plight of rural America coming from West Virginia. Every single day, I've treated patients. I know the pain. I know the suffering. I've seen people die in my arms. What we're trying to do right now is to meet people where they are. Somebody's overdosing, they need naloxone or Narcan. I, as a doctor, as you know this, cannot treat dead people. So first thing we've got to do is keep people alive. We also have to get them into treatment and go after the bad guys and their trafficking profits. And this is the reason that the president is committed to making sure we have technology at the border that detect every bit of fentanyl that's coming through. That's a commitment and top priority of the president.
But Dr. Gupta, if I may, this administration and Democrats proved us they believe in walls because they erected one around the Capitol when they felt threatened after January 6th. A wall at the southern border would stop drugs from flowing in. That is a fact. Walls work. We know they work. We lock our doors and windows at night inside when we go inside our homes. We protect our children with locked doors and walls. They work. A wall would be the best way to stop drugs from coming in and reduce the amount of drugs. I think that would be the wisest way to go, don't you?
Congressman, thank you. I went down there several times. The last time I saw gapes in the border barrier system.
But the Biden administration has stopped construction. There's gaping holes, there's broken fences, there's portions that don't work because the Biden administration has stopped construction and stopped funding.
There's 68 that have been already fixed, and there's 62 more on the way to be fixed. We still have tunnels to deal with. We have drones to deal with. So I think what we can do coming together on this is to build the best barrier protections possible. That includes those barriers.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Gupta. I agree. One last question, because our time is short. I read in the news the Biden admin is funding crack pipe distribution to advance racial equality. Is that a practice that you believe? I'm not sure how crack pipes advance racial equality. As a matter of fact, I'll go ahead and state for the record, I believe we're all equal, and I think crack pipes are probably leading to furthering the drug problem, not helping it.
I can commit to you that no federal funding is going to what you've mentioned, but I will say that naloxone, ability for people to check for fentanyl in their drug supply so they can not take it, and syringe services programs are critical and they're life-saving, and that's why we're doing those.
Thank you, Dr. Gupta. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. Now, ask my questions for 5 minutes. Director Gupta, when we recently met in my office, discussed the issue of fentanyl overdose deaths, you spoke about your mission and sense of urgency. Would you agree that illicit fentanyl is one of the most urgent crises facing our nation, especially considering that a majority of the overdose deaths in the United States are happening due to fentanyl?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, and that's exactly the way we're approaching this.
You're familiar with the supply chains of illicit fentanyl entering the U.S. markets, correct? You mentioned that. Yeah. Do you concur with DEA's assessment that virtually all the deadly fentanyl found in the United States is mass-produced by transnational criminal organizations operating in Mexico using China-sourced precursor chemicals and then trafficked across the border? It's being smuggled in both at ports of entry and in between ports of entry. So can you describe for me and for my constituents in Kentucky who will be watching this clip, what efforts Office of National Drug Control Policy has directed to increase the ability of law enforcement personnel at the border to identify and seize as much of the fentanyl as possible?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have significantly increased the ability of law enforcement to be able to do that. We have some of the highest numbers of law enforcement officials, including Customs and Border Protection, on the border to make sure, and we are investing in technology that is known to detect fentanyl when we have so much traffic back and forth, understanding we want to be able to detect every vehicle that we need to detect with fentanyl. We also, in President's proposed budget, is $500 million. It includes $300 million for technology to be able to do just that.
So we've heard that the historic levels of illegal border crossings in the last few years has had an impact on the ability of Customs and Border Protection personnel with respect to the fentanyl crisis by diverting manpower and resources, and in some cases even temporarily shutting down interior checkpoints operated by U.S. Border Patrol that frequently encounter narcotics loads that made it past Customs and Border Patrol at the ports. So what has Office of National Drug Control Policy been doing to coordinate with border and immigration officials to ensure that they're able to respond to narcotics smuggling across the border?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're proposing and providing them more resources than ever before. We're making sure that they have what they need to protect, safeguard when we talk about drugs coming in.
They tell us they don't have what they need. When we talk to them and there aren't any of their superiors around, they tell us they don't have what they need.
I'll give you, Mr. Chairman, an example. I was down at the Arizona border. I talked to them same way when there were no superiors there. I asked them. I saw a gaping in the barriers, and I said, why isn't this fixed? They said, well, it needs to come through. I said, well, we want to make sure that this gets prioritized. So we are listening to the folks on the ground, what they need. We're proud of the work they're doing, and we want to provide support to them in an urgent way.
So does Office of National Drug Control Policy have the ability to direct agencies' funds in some cases?
It is there, but it is inconsistent, Mr. Chairman.
So what authorities do you have as director to certify or direct agencies' funding towards fighting the overdose crisis?
Mr. Chairman, we have something called the Fund Control Notice that allows us to direct drug control spending on particular projects or activities to ensure that agencies are appropriately implementing those policies. But that's not consistent across.
Do you have the authority over the Department of Justice or its component agencies?
I think that one, based on a almost 30-year-old appropriations piece, we do not have that.
That's a problem. That's not your fault. So that would include the DEA or DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, or Drug Enforcement Administration, correct? You don't have authority over DEA.
We have inconsistent authority across the 19 drug budget control agencies, of course.
So how has that affected your ability to respond to the opioid crisis?
Well, I'll give you an example. During the Bush administration, ONDCP frequently issued this fund control notice to each of the agencies, restricting a portion of their available budget authority until they submitted a financial plan for the director for approval. That ability exists for most agencies, but doesn't exist for every agency.
So my last question, I assume you would agree that criminal prosecutions of individuals involved in the illicit fentanyl trade are important at disrupting the supply chains, correct?
Yes.
Don't you think it would be a better use of the Department of Justice's prosecutorial efforts instead of retaliating against whistleblowers or investigating parents at school board meetings to coordinate with you and go after the individuals who are poisoning the American people?
Mr. Chairman, we work very closely with the Department of Justice and other 18 federal drug control agencies. I can tell you they're very fully committed to going after both sanctioning and after prosecution of the cartel members and their enablers.
Well, we could debate that all day long, but again, I appreciate you being here, and that concludes our questioning portion. I'm going to now yield to Ranking Member Raskins for closing remarks he would like to give.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for a very good hearing today. I want to start by introducing for the record a letter from the United States Conference of Mayors expressing their strong support for reauthorization of the Office of National Drug Control Policy.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The fentanyl and opioid crisis is a nightmare for America, for our communities, and for our families. Every member of this committee has lost young constituents in this public health and public safety catastrophe, and we hope and we pray that we will never have to call another family in our districts to send our sympathy and our love. In Maryland, last year, there were more than 2,500 overdoses in the state total, more than 2,000 of them coming from fentanyl alone. Mr. Chairman, I just want to make a couple of points in closing to this significant hearing. As Dr. Gupta has explained, there has been this massive increase and unprecedented investment in new technologies for the CBP and for the DEA to crack down specifically on the importation of illicit fentanyl into the country. In 2022, the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Areas Program led to the seizure of $22 billion in illicit drugs and in cash, which actually meant that it yielded $82 to our law enforcement agencies for every dollar that was spent in taxpayer money in the program. In the same year, the DEA seized an historic 260,000 pounds of illicit drugs, including 15,000 pounds of illicit fentanyl. So we're seeing huge increases in the number of drugs being stopped at the border. And the only real dispute I heard today was whether or not that was a sign of progress or a sign of failure. Some of our colleagues were claiming that that was a sign of failure, that there was this massive increase in the drugs being interdicted. But I was persuaded very much by Dr. Gupta's testimony that this is as a product of the massive new influx of technology catching the drugs that are coming over. So it is a major success in interdiction. Now, that doesn't necessarily represent overall success in drug control, which involves not just interdiction, but also public health measures, combating of addiction, and so on. So it was just a non sequitur when some of our colleagues were saying, well, yes, there's this huge increase in interdiction, but why are all these people dying? And there's an increase in many communities in people dying. Well, it's because of it potentially increased use, but also the infiltration of dangerous drugs in other kinds of drugs that people are taking, you know, for example, anti-anxiety medicine and so on. But that, to me, underscores the importance of doing an investment in public health and getting our people off of these drugs. My distinguished colleague from Georgia said, well, just build the wall. Of course, there was a promise in the last administration that Mexico would pay for a wall. We're still waiting for that to happen. But my colleague said, well, we build walls and fences around our houses, and that works. It doesn't work if people are voluntarily bringing drugs into your home. And we cannot deny the demand side of this equation. I salute the administration's work on reducing the supply coming in with all of these great new technologies. But as long as the demand is there, we're going to have a very serious problem in America. So we need to address the demand side as well. And I am happy to know, Dr. Gupta, that you are equally invested in reducing the supply and the demand. Now, the other point I wanted to make, Mr. Chairman, that came up today, and I think most recently from our distinguished colleague from Texas, Mr. Sessions, where he said, well, it's easy enough to blame China, but what's the role we're playing in contributing to this? And I appreciated his saying we don't want to just blame everything on China and then just go home. On the other hand, it's very important. I agreed with Mr. Edwards from North Carolina saying we should be doing whatever we can do to try to get China to crack down on the supply of these chemicals to the Mexican narco traffickers, the drug traffickers in Mexico, even if they're legal. He was saying, even if these are legal chemicals, it's important to crack down if they know what it's going to be used for. And the exact same point applies to the trafficking of firearms from America to buyers who know they are going to be dealing to the Mexican fentanyl dealers. And when the gun dealers in America and the gun manufacturers in America understand precisely where those guns are going. At least 70% of the firearms that are being used by the fentanyl traffickers in Mexico come from the United States. And some estimates are as high as 90% are coming from the United States. And so the recipe seems to be for these drug traffickers and gun traffickers is guns down from the U.S. to Mexico, drugs back from Mexico into the U.S. Those are the two sides of the coin. And so, Mr. Chairman, I think we've got to address the problem that it is American gun dealers and manufacturers who are supplying Mexican fentanyl and opioid dealers with the guns that they need to operate with impunity in complete lawlessness in Mexico. And they're responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of people in Mexico and upwards of 100,000 disappeared people in Mexico. So if we're going to take the problem seriously, let's take our own investment in the problem seriously, as Mr. Sessions was saying, because it is American guns that are making it possible for Mexican drug traffickers to operate in such a lawless way. But I'm pleased that we're making bipartisan progress on this. I'm pleased at the interdiction efforts that are taking place. We need to accelerate our investment in the public health measures to get our people off of these deadly drugs and to see dramatic reductions in the number of people who are overdosing in our country. With that, I thank you for your leadership on this, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back to you.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize myself for a closing statement. Again, I would like to thank you, Director Gupta, for appearing before the committee today. Fighting this crisis is an urgent battle, and it's essential that we conduct rigorous oversight over the government's efforts to stem the tide of drug overdose deaths. The drug overdose crisis is one of the most urgent issues our nation faces. And as Director Gupta informed us, emerging threats like xylazine continue to make this situation even more dire. I agree with how Director Gupta framed this issue as not just an issue of public health, but a national security crisis as well. Getting the border crisis under control is an essential component of this issue, but I agree with my Democratic colleagues that the border is only part of the story. We know that foreign bad actors like the Chinese Communist Party are taking actions to hurt our nation through the fentanyl trade. We know that because China is the source country for the precursor chemicals that making fentanyl in secret labs in Mexico. We know that China is involved in illicit financing and money laundering operations, and we know that the Chinese Communist Party refuses to cooperate with